Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the past is approached slowly, thoughtfully, and without the rush of modern noise. Tonight we settle beside one of the longest rivers on earth and trace the lives of those who stood at its banks wearing crowns of gold and linen, calling themselves kings and being called gods. This is the full story of the Pharaohs, the rulers of ancient Egypt who governed not only land and people, but belief itself. Egypt is often imagined in bright fragments, pyramids rising from sand, colossal statues seated in eternal stillness, walls covered in carved figures walking in neat profile, a mask of gold staring forward with calm certainty. Yet behind each of those images stood a living person who ate, slept, aged, worried about harvests, commanded armies, and was expected to maintain the balance of the entire universe. The title of Pharaoh carried weight far beyond a throne. It was an office that merged politics, religion, architecture, agriculture, astronomy, and ritual into a single human figure. The word Pharaoh itself originally referred to the royal palace, the great house. Over time, the term shifted to mean the ruler who lived within that house. By the height of Egyptian civilization, the pharaoh was not simply a monarch. He was considered the earthly embodiment of Horus in life and associated with Osiris in death. He was mediator between the gods and the people. He was responsible for Ma'at, the principle of order, balance and justice that kept chaos at bay. If the Nile flooded properly, if crops grew, if enemies were held back, if the sun rose each morning, these were signs that the pharaoh was fulfilling his duty. It is easy from a modern perspective to separate myth from administration, to imagine that divine language was only symbolic. In ancient Egypt, the line did not exist in the same way. The spiritual and the practical were woven tightly together. When a pharaoh ordered the construction of a temple, it was both an act of devotion and a declaration of power. When he led troops into battle, it was both a military campaign and a cosmic act to defeat disorder. Even the simple act of being crowned was staged as a sacred transformation. As you listen, picture your own surroundings for a moment. Perhaps you're in a quiet room with soft light. Perhaps the hour is late and the day has settled. Somewhere in the world, morning is unfolding instead. In every place, time moves forward at its steady pace, just as it did along the Nile thousands of years ago. Civilizations rise and fall, but the rhythm of day and night remains. The pharaohs measured their reigns by regnal years, by flood seasons, by jubilees celebrating decades of rule. We measure ours by calendars and digital clocks. The need to organize time connects us to them more closely than it first appears. If you find this journey steady and absorbing, if the ancient world feels close enough to touch, consider offering a quiet gesture of support by liking the video or subscribing. It allows this calm exploration of history to reach others who enjoy a slower unfolding of the past. The story of the pharaohs stretches across more than 3,000 years. That span is longer than the time between the fall of Rome and the present day. It covers moments of unity and moments of fracture, strong rulers and weak heirs, monumental ambition and quiet decline. It begins before there was a single crown, before pyramids, before monumental temples lined the river. It begins with the land itself. Egypt's geography shaped everything that followed. The Nile River flows from south to north, emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. Each year in antiquity, the river flooded its banks, leaving behind rich black silt that made agriculture possible in an otherwise arid landscape. To the west and east lay deserts that acted as natural barriers against invasion. To the north stretched the sea. To the south, cataracts in the river formed additional protection. This narrow ribbon of fertile land created a civilization that was both isolated and intensely focused. In early times, before written records, small communities developed along the Nile. They farmed barley and wheat, raised cattle, crafted pottery, and buried their dead with care. Over generations, local leaders emerged. Villages grew into towns. Trade networks expanded, cultural practices became shared across larger regions. Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north developed distinct identities, symbolized by different crowns. The white crown represented Upper Egypt, the red crown represented Lower Egypt. At some point around 3100 BCE, these two regions were unified under a single ruler. Tradition names this ruler Nama, sometimes identified with a king called Menes in later sources. A ceremonial palette carved in stone shows a king wearing the white crown on one side and the red crown on the other, striking down an enemy and inspecting rows of defeated foes. It is one of the earliest visual declarations of centralized authority. From that moment onward, the concept of a single ruler over a unified land took hold. The pharaoh was born not only as a political figure, but as a symbol of unity. The early dynasties established many patterns that endured for centuries. Royal burials became more elaborate. Writing, in the form of hieroglyphs, developed as a tool of administration and commemoration. Officials were appointed to manage agriculture, collect taxes in the form of grain, and oversee construction projects. The pharaoh stood at the top of a carefully structured hierarchy. Beneath him were viziers, priests, scribes, and regional governors. Beneath them were artisans, farmers, and labourers. Order was visible in every level of society. As dynasties passed, the power of the pharaoh expanded alongside architectural ambition. The Old Kingdom, often called the Age of the Pyramids, saw the construction of massive stone tombs that still dominate the Giza Plateau. These pyramids were not built by enslaved populations as older myths once claimed, but by organised labour forces composed largely of Egyptian workers, fulfilling a state obligation during the Nile's flood season when farming was impossible. Entire communities supported these projects, supplying food, tools and transportation. The pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a statement in stone that the pharaoh's authority extended beyond death. Within its chambers lay the king's body, preserved through mummification, surrounded by goods meant to sustain him in the afterlife. Texts carved inside later pyramids described spells and rituals to guide the deceased ruler through the underworld. The afterlife was not imagined as a vague hope. It was mapped, named and prepared for with practical detail. Divinity in Egypt was not distant. The gods were believed to inhabit statues in temples, to accept offerings of bread and beer, to require daily rituals. The pharaoh, as chief priest, was responsible for maintaining these relationships. Even when he delegated daily ceremonies to temple clergy, the authority behind each act flowed from him. If that was disrupted, if famine struck or rebellion rose, it could be interpreted as a failure of divine harmony. Yet the pharaoh was also human. Inscriptions reveal pride, fear of enemies, concern for legacy. Some rulers boasted of military victories in Nubia or against Asiatic powers in the Levant. Others emphasized internal building programs, irrigation improvements, or legal reforms. The image presented in monumental reliefs often showed an idealized figure, eternally youthful and strong, but letters and administrative documents hint at illness, succession disputes, and economic strain. The expectation that a single individual could sustain cosmic balance placed immense symbolic pressure on the office. When central authority weakened during periods known as intermediate periods, regional governors gained autonomy. Competing claimants declared themselves kings. Trade routes faltered. Artistic styles shifted. These intervals of fragmentation were later portrayed as times of chaos, reinforcing the idea that strong centralized rule was necessary for order. Throughout these centuries, the visual language of kingship remained remarkably consistent. The pharaoh was depicted larger than other figures in reliefs. He wore specific regalia: the Nemes headcloth, the false beard, the crook and flail crossed over his chest. Each element carried meaning tied to shepherding the people and maintaining authority. Even female rulers adopted these symbols. Hatshepsut, who had reigned centuries later, presented herself in male regalia in official art to reinforce continuity. The relationship between ruler and ruled was complex. Farmers laboured in fields that technically belonged to the crown. Taxes were collected in kind. Large building projects required coordination across regions. At the same time, temples redistributed food, employed workers, and provided stability. The pharaoh's court was a centre of culture, commissioning statues, jewellery, and inscriptions that shaped Egyptian identity. Foreign relations also shaped the institution. Egypt traded gold, linen, and grain for cedarwood, incense, and luxury goods. Diplomatic letters exchanged with Near Eastern kings show marriages arranged to secure alliances. Military campaigns extended influence into Nubia and Syria at various times. The pharaoh was presented abroad as a powerful monarch among peers, though within Egypt he remained uniquely divine. As you continue listening, allow the long timeline to settle into place. 3 millennia of rulers followed one another in succession. Some reigned for decades, celebrating jubilees known as Esed festivals that reaffirmed vitality and legitimacy. Others lasted only months before intrigue or illness removed them. Each added a layer to the institution. The expectation of eternal memory shaped decisions. Names were carved into stone to endure. Cartouches encircled royal names, protecting them symbolically. To erase a predecessor's name was to attack their immortality. This practice occurred during periods of political conflict. Later rulers sometimes chiselled away the names of rivals, attempting to rewrite lineage. Yet archaeology has recovered many of these stories. The sun rose each day over temple pylons, aligned carefully with celestial events. Priests observed stars to maintain calendars. The agricultural cycle depended on accurate prediction of the flood. In this environment, kingship was tied to cosmic order in practical ways. A failed harvest was not only economic hardship, but a sign of imbalance. Egyptian religion evolved across time. Deities gained prominence, merged, or shifted in character. The cult of Amun rose to power during the New Kingdom, enriching the priesthood at Thebes. At one dramatic moment, a pharaoh named Akhenaten attempted to redirect worship toward a single solar deity, the Aten, building a new capital and suppressing traditional cults. His experiment was short-lived, and after his death, traditional religion returned with force. Even so, this episode reveals that the office of pharaoh included authority over belief itself. In thinking about rulers who were treated as gods, it is important to recognize that the concept did not eliminate accountability. Texts describe the weighing of the heart in the afterlife, where even kings were judged. Ma'at applied to all. The pharaoh's role was to uphold it, not stand above it. The span of this story includes figures familiar by name today. Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, Senusret, consolidator of Middle Kingdom power, Hatshepsut, who expanded trade networks, Thutmose III, military strategist, Ramesses II, whose monuments filled the landscape, Tutankhamun, whose relatively intact tomb revealed treasures to the modern world, Cleopatra VII, who ruled in a Hellenistic context and navigated alliances with Rome. Each lived in a different political and cultural moment, yet all bore the same title. As centuries advanced, external pressures grew. Libyan and Nubian rulers took the throne. Assyrian armies marched into the Nile Valley. Persian kings claimed the title of pharaoh. Eventually, Alexander the Great was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule and founded a new dynasty under his successors. The Ptolemies blended Greek and Egyptian traditions, culminating in Cleopatra's reign. After her defeat, Egypt became a province of Rome. The line of native pharaohs ended, but the memory endured. The endurance of the institution lies partly in its adaptability. Over millennia, the structure of governance shifted, artistic styles evolved, religious practices adjusted, and foreign influences were absorbed. The core concept of a ruler responsible for maintaining order persisted. That persistence allowed Egypt to maintain cultural continuity longer than almost any other ancient civilization. Tonight, as this narrative begins to stretch backward into its earliest phase, consider the land before crowns were shaped in metal or linen. Consider the communities along the Nile before a single ruler claimed both Upper and Lower Egypt. The emergence of pharaonic kingship did not happen in isolation. It grew from geography, agriculture, trade, belief, and the slow accumulation of authority in local leaders. Before there was a unified throne, there were villages marking seasons by the river's rise and fall, burying their dead with pottery and simple goods, watching the sky for signs of change. The path from those early settlements to the glittering courts of later dynasties was gradual. Symbols of leadership appeared first in small ways: decorative mace heads, larger tombs for certain individuals, signs that some held more influence than others. Over time, those distinctions hardened into hierarchy. The merging of two lands under one ruler was not only a political act, but the culmination of generations of development. The pharaoh, as a figure of divine authority, stands at the centre of this long unfolding story, but the foundation was laid by farmers, craftsmen, and regional chiefs long before monumental stone rose against the horizon. As we move further back toward that beginning, the crowns are set aside for a moment, and attention turns to the Nile itself, flowing steadily through landscapes where the first seeds of kingship were planted. Long before a human head carried the weight of the white or red crown, before cartouches enclosed royal names, before stone was cut into angles that still defy easy explanation, there was a river moving through a narrow band of green. The Nile did not need a throne. It did not require ceremony. It flooded, receded, and flooded again, and in doing so it shaped the earliest version of Egypt. If you strip away the monuments and the legends, what remains at the beginning is water and silt. Each year rains falling far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands swelled the river. By the time the flood reached the Nile Valley, it spilled over its banks and spread across the flat land. When the water retreated, it left behind a layer of dark, fertile soil. That soil was unlike the surrounding desert. It was soft, rich, and capable of sustaining crops in a region where rain was rare. In this environment, the river functioned as the true ruler. It dictated planting seasons. It defined settlement patterns. It created natural highways for movement and trade. It also set limits. Too little flooding meant drought and hunger. Too much flooding meant destruction of homes and fields. The people who lived along its banks learned to observe its rhythms carefully, because survival depended on understanding patterns that could not be negotiated with. The earliest communities in the Nile Valley were small and scattered. Archaeological evidence from the Badarian and Naqada cultures, dating back to the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, reveals farming villages with mud brick houses, storage pits, and simple graves. These were not yet cities. They were clusters of families who cultivated barley and emmer wheat, raised cattle and goats, and fished in the river's channels. Their tools were made of stone, bone, and copper in later phases. Their pottery was often decorated with geometric patterns and images of boats, animals, and human figures. Those boats carved or painted onto pottery were not artistic flourishes. They reflected a practical reality. The Nile served as the primary route of travel. It flowed northward, while prevailing winds from the Mediterranean allowed boats to sail south with relative ease. This natural two-way system meant that even in early periods, communities were not entirely isolated. Ideas, goods, and people moved along the river long before centralized rule. The desert surrounding the valley played an equally important role. To the west lay the vast Sahara. To the east stretched rocky highlands leading toward the Red Sea. These regions were not empty, but they were harsh. As climate patterns shifted over millennia and parts of North Africa became drier, populations gradually concentrated along the Nile. The river became not just a resource but a refuge. This concentration fostered interaction and competition. Burial practices provide some of the clearest windows into these early societies. Graves from the Naqada period reveal increasing social differentiation. Some individuals were buried with more elaborate goods, carved pallets, jewellery made from semi-precious stones, imported materials such as lapis lazuli and ceremonial objects. The presence of such items suggests trade networks extending beyond Egypt's borders, reaching into Nubia and the Near East. It also suggests that certain individuals held greater status. Status in these communities likely emerged from control over resources, success in organising labour, or skill in managing trade and ritual. Leadership at this stage was local. A village or cluster of settlements might recognise a chief or headman, but there was no evidence yet of a single ruler claiming authority over the entire valley. The concept of a unified Egypt had not taken shape. Instead, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north developed distinct cultural styles and symbols. Lower Egypt in the broad delta, where the Nile fans into multiple branches, was characterised by marshlands and access to Mediterranean trade routes. Upper Egypt, with its narrower valley and closer proximity to Nubia, developed somewhat different artistic conventions and burial traditions. Over time, competition between regional centres appears to have intensified. Larger settlements emerged, such as Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt and Buto in Lower Egypt. These were proto-urban centres with evidence of craft specialisation and ceremonial structures. Hierakonpolis, in particular, offers insight into the consolidation of power before kingship fully formed. Excavations there have uncovered large ceremonial buildings, specialised workshops and richly furnished graves. One burial, often referred to as Tomb 100, contains painted scenes that include boats, human figures and possible ritual imagery. These scenes predate formal hieroglyphic writing, yet they suggest emerging symbolic language tied to authority and ritual performance. Control over irrigation and agricultural surplus would have been a decisive factor in the rise of powerful local leaders. Coordinating labour to build dikes, dig canals and manage storage required organisation. Those who could ensure a stable food supply gained influence. Surplus grain could support artisans, traders and warriors. In this way, economic stability and political power became intertwined. Conflict likely played a role as well. Some archaeological evidence indicates fortified settlements and weaponry. Decorative palettes from the late pre-dynastic period show scenes of domination and subdued enemies. These objects were not everyday tools, they were ceremonial, designed to communicate strength and victory. Even before the first crown, imagery of a powerful individual overcoming rivals had begun to circulate. Religious ideas were also taking shape during this time. Early deities were often associated with natural forces, animals and local landscapes. Falcon imagery, later linked with Horus, appears in pre-dynastic contexts. The sky, the river, the fertile earth, and the desert each carried symbolic weight. Ritual practices surrounding burial indicate belief in some form of continued existence after death. Bodies were often placed in a fetal position, oriented westward toward the setting sun, which may have held symbolic meaning. The west bank of the Nile became associated with death because the sun set in that direction. This association endured for thousands of years, influencing the placement of major necropolises. Even in the earliest graves, the connection between celestial cycles and human life was evident. The river's flood, the sun's daily journey, and seasonal changes formed a pattern that early Egyptians observed closely. Over time, these observations crystallized into religious narratives. As regional centers grew stronger, competition between Upper and Lower Egypt intensified. Archaeological finds from the late Naqada III period suggest increasing political centralization in Upper Egypt. Symbols that would later become royal insignia begin to appear. The Serek, a rectangular enclosure representing the palace facade with a falcon perched above. Standards bearing emblems, and iconography depicting a dominant ruler. The process that led to full unification was gradual rather than sudden. Military conquest, strategic marriage alliances, economic dominance and religious integration likely all played parts. By the time a ruler identified as Nama emerged, the groundwork had already been laid by generations of consolidation. The famous Nama palette discovered at Hierakonpolis is often cited as evidence of unification. It depicts a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, symbolically uniting the two lands. Before that moment, however, the Nile remained the primary organising force. Its flood cycles were predictable enough to allow planning, but variable enough to require vigilance. Measuring the height of the flood became an early form of environmental monitoring. Nilometers, later constructed in stone, allowed priests and officials to record water levels. In pre-dynastic times, simpler markers and experience would have served the same purpose. Anticipating the flood meant anticipating prosperity or hardship. Agriculture was organised around three main seasons: inundation, when fields were submerged; emergence, when crops were planted in the receding silt; and harvest, when grain was collected and stored. This cyclical structure shaped daily life. Work rhythms followed the river's timetable rather than a ruler's decree. In that sense, the Nile was the first sovereign. Craft specialisation expanded as communities stabilised. Potters, stone carvers, weavers and metal workers refined their skills. Trade routes extended south into Nubia, where gold and ivory were available, and east towards Sinai, where copper could be mined. The exchange of goods fostered cultural connections beyond the Nile Valley. Exotic materials found in graves indicate that even early leaders sought objects that signalled status and access to distant networks. Writing in the form of proto-hieroglyphs began to appear in the late pre-dynastic period. Short inscriptions on pottery and tags likely recorded ownership, contents, or ritual dedications. The development of writing was tied closely to administration. As communities grew and surplus increased, tracking resources became necessary. The emergence of record-keeping marked a significant shift toward organised governance. Social stratification deepened. Larger tombs with multiple chambers and rich grave goods contrast sharply with simpler burials nearby. This disparity indicates that hierarchy was becoming institutionalised. The idea that certain individuals possessed authority extending beyond their immediate household took hold. Ritual performance, possibly involving early priestly roles, reinforced this authority. The environment itself contributed to a sense of stability and continuity. Unlike regions subject to unpredictable rainfall or frequent invasions, the Nile Valley offered relative consistency. Desert barriers limited large-scale incursions. The river's annual cycle, though not identical each year, followed a pattern that could be anticipated. This reliability fostered a worldview in which order seemed attainable and worth preserving. That concept of order would later be expressed as Mayat, but its roots lay in lived experience long before it was named. When the flood came at the right time and left behind fertile soil, it confirmed a pattern. When crops grew and communities thrived, it reinforced the expectation that balance was possible. The transition from river-based order to king-based order required only a shift in attribution. Instead of viewing stability as purely natural, it could be framed as maintained by a divinely sanctioned ruler. As pre-dynastic society approached the threshold of dynastic kingship, symbolism became more standardized. The imagery of a ruler subduing enemies, often shown larger than other figures, established visual hierarchy. Animal motifs, including bulls and falcons, signalled strength and divine association. These images were not random decoration. They were tools of communication, conveying legitimacy and dominance across communities that may not have shared a spoken dialect. The consolidation of Upper Egypt appears to have preceded full unification. Sites such as Abydos became important burial centres for powerful leaders. Large tombs with multiple chambers and evidence of human and animal sacrifice suggest that early rulers were already claiming extraordinary status. These practices indicate belief in an afterlife where attendance and provisions were required, foreshadowing later royal burials. Throughout this gradual centralisation, the Nile continued its steady course. It did not acknowledge political shifts. It flooded whether villages cooperated or competed. Yet the ability to organise labour for flood management and surplus distribution increasingly depended on strong leadership. Authority became practical before it became divine. Once centralized power proved effective in maintaining prosperity, attributing that power to divine favor strengthened its permanence. When the first crown was placed upon a unified ruler's head, it symbolized more than victory. It represented the culmination of environmental adaptation, economic coordination, social stratification, and symbolic innovation. The river had shaped the land and its people. Now a human figure would claim to embody that shaping force. Before stone pyramids, before temple complexes, before the codified rituals of coronation, there was a long period in which the Nile alone set the tempo. Communities rose and interacted under its watch. Leaders emerged not because of inherited divinity, but because organization, protection, and resource control demanded coordination. Over generations, that coordination solidified into kingship. As attention moves toward the moment of unification, and the figure traditionally associated with it, the transformation from regional chieftaincy to dynastic monarchy comes into clearer focus. The land that the Nile sustained was ready for a single throne, and the next phase of this unfolding story centers on the ruler who wore both crowns and declared that two lands were one. By the time Narmer's name appears in the archaeological record, the Nile Valley had already spent centuries learning how to organize itself. Regional powers had grown strong in Upper Egypt. Symbols of authority had become recognizable. Burial sites at Abydos and Hierakonpolis had grown larger and more elaborate, suggesting leaders who commanded not only respect, but labor. What Narmer represents is not the sudden birth of kingship, but the moment when kingship became unmistakably centralized. Narmer's identity rests most clearly on a ceremonial object carved from siltstone, now known as the Narmer pallet. It was discovered in the late 19th century at Hierakonpolis, buried in what appears to have been a ritual deposit. The pallet itself was not a practical tool. Earlier pallets were used to grind pigments, perhaps for cosmetics or ritual markings. Narmer's version was monumental in scale and covered in carved relief. It was designed to be seen, interpreted, and remembered. On one side of the pallet, a king wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt stands poised to strike a kneeling enemy with a raised mace. His stance is deliberate. One arm extends downward to grasp the captive's hair. The other lifts the weapon high. Behind him stands a sandal bearer, smaller in scale, emphasizing hierarchy. Before him, the falcon god Horus perches upon a bundle of papyrus plants, symbolically dominating Lower Egypt, whose marshes were associated with papyrus growth. The imagery is not subtle. It communicates conquest and divine endorsement. On the reverse side, the same king now wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. He inspects rows of decapitated enemies. Above him, intertwined necks of two fantastical creatures form a circular depression at the center of the pallet. Some scholars interpret these creatures as symbolic of the merging of two lands. Others view them as imported motifs adapted to Egyptian meaning. Below, a bull, often associated with royal power, tramples a fortified settlement. Taken together, the scenes tell a story of domination and integration. Whether they record a single historical event or represent a symbolic narrative of unification remains debated. What is clear is that by Narmer's time, the concept of a ruler claiming authority over both Upper and Lower Egypt had taken visual form. The white and red crowns appear together. The message is consistent. Two lands are now governed by one throne. Narmer's name appears within a serek, the rectangular device representing the palace facade. Above it sits a falcon, reinforcing association with Horus. The serek would become a standard feature of royal names in early dynasties. Its appearance on objects across multiple sites suggests that Narmer's authority was recognized beyond a single region. Unification was not only about military victory, it required administrative integration. Upper and Lower Egypt differed in geography, economy, and cultural practice. The delta's marshlands contrasted with the narrow valley of the south. Bringing these regions under centralised control meant coordinating taxation, trade, and labour across varied landscapes. It also meant establishing a capital positioned to manage both territories effectively. Tradition holds that Memphis, located near the apex of the delta where Upper and Lower Egypt meet, became the administrative centre. Its strategic position allowed oversight of river traffic and access to both agricultural heartlands and trade routes. While direct evidence linking Narmer to Memphis remains limited, early dynastic kings clearly recognised the importance of that location. The political structure that emerged after unification shows signs of careful organisation. Titles for officials become more standardised. Administrative seals indicate oversight of granaries, workshops and estates. The role of vizier, later the highest official beneath the king, likely developed from earlier advisory positions. The bureaucracy necessary to manage a unified state began to take shape. Religious integration accompanied political consolidation. Upper Egypt's association with the falcon god Horus merged with Lower Egypt's symbols, such as the cobra goddess Wadjet. The royal uraeus, a stylized cobra worn on the king's forehead in later periods, reflects this merging of traditions. Divine sanction for the ruler was not confined to one region's deity, it became national in scope. The symbolism of duality persisted throughout Egyptian history. The king bore the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt. The two ladies, referring to protective goddesses of each region, were invoked in royal titulary. The dual crown, combining white and red into a single headdress, visually reinforced unity. These elements did more than commemorate Narmer's achievement. They institutionalized the idea that Egypt's strength lay in balanced integration. Archaeological evidence from Abydos suggests that Narmer may have been buried there. Tombs attributed to early dynastic kings in this necropolis display increasing complexity. Mud brick chambers lined with timber, surrounded by subsidiary burials, reflect emerging royal mortuary practices. Some of these subsidiary burials appear to contain individuals sacrificed to accompany the king in death, a practice that would later be abandoned. The scale of these tombs indicates a ruler commanding significant resources. The early dynastic period that followed Narmer's reign saw continued consolidation. Kings such as Aha, Jer and Den expanded administrative reach. They built ceremonial enclosures and maintained connections with distant regions through trade and military presence. Narmer's achievement did not create a stable state overnight. It initiated a process of refinement. One question often raised concerns the nature of resistance in Lower Egypt. The imagery of conquest implies conflict, but the degree and duration remain uncertain. It is possible that some regions accepted integration through alliance rather than force. Marriage alliances, economic incentives and shared religious rituals could have eased transition. The archaeological record shows cultural blending rather than abrupt replacement. Narmer's legacy lies partly in establishing precedent. Once unification was achieved and represented symbolically, subsequent rulers inherited a defined territorial concept. Egypt was no longer a collection of competing chiefdoms. It was a unified kingdom with a centralized ideology. That ideology placed the king at its core, responsible for maintaining harmony between two lands. The annual flood of the Nile continued to shape life. Under unified rule, large-scale irrigation projects could be coordinated more effectively. Surplus from one region could compensate for shortages in another. Trade expeditions could be organized with greater resources. Centralization enhanced resilience, at least when leadership remained strong. Writing expanded during this period. Hieroglyphs became more standardized, appearing on labels, seals, and stone vessels. Recording regnal years and significant events reinforced continuity. The king's name travelled with goods and official documents, extending presence beyond physical appearance. Administration and ideology worked together. Artistic conventions established under Narmer endured. The canonical profile pose, hierarchical scale, and composite perspective became defining features of Egyptian visual culture. These conventions were not merely aesthetic. They reinforced social order and clarity. The king appeared larger because his status was greater. Enemies appeared subdued because disorder was to be controlled. Narmer's unification also had implications for foreign relations. A centralized Egypt could project power more effectively into Nubia and the Levant. Trade routes became more secure. Control over copper mines in Sinai and gold in Nubia strengthened economic foundations. Military expeditions depicted on early reliefs suggest expansionist ambitions. The ideology of kingship matured rapidly after unification. The king was increasingly portrayed not just as victorious warrior, but as guarantor of cosmic order. Ritual scenes show him offering to gods, building temples, and performing ceremonies. The dual role of political leader and divine intermediary solidified. Narmer may not have fully embodied later theological sophistication, but the framework began in his era. Burial practices reflect evolving concepts of the afterlife. Early dynastic tombs contained goods necessary for continued existence: pottery, tools, food, and ornaments. The belief that the king would persist beyond death justified the allocation of immense resources to his burial. This expectation would later culminate in pyramid construction, but its origins lie in these early tombs. The administrative challenges of governing a unified state required delegation. Provincial governors, later known as nomarchs, oversaw regions called nomes. Their loyalty was essential. In early periods, these officials were often appointed by the king and buried near royal centres, reinforcing connection. Over time, as seen in later intermediate periods, regional autonomy could grow when central power weakened. Narmer's system depended on maintaining that balance. The concept of two lands endured as a fundamental element of identity. It was not erased after unification. Instead, it was preserved as a duality under one authority. This recognition of distinct origins under a single ruler contributed to stability. It acknowledged diversity while enforcing unity. Narmer's personal biography remains largely unknown. No detailed inscriptions describe his thoughts or policies. His presence is constructed from artifacts bearing his name and imagery. Yet the impact attributed to him is immense. By claiming both crowns, he transformed a regional landscape into a territorial state. Subsequent generations remembered unification as a foundational event. King lists compiled centuries later begin with early dynastic rulers, placing Narmer or Menes at the start of formal history. Myth and memory blurred. The act of unification became part of national origin narrative. It is important to recognize that unification was a process, not a single battle. Narmer symbolizes its culmination. Cultural integration, administrative organization, and religious synthesis required time. The palette captures a moment of triumph, but the work of sustaining unity extended through multiple reigns. As the early dynastic period progressed, architectural experimentation increased. Kings built funerary enclosures at Abydos and Saqqara. These structures foreshadowed later monumental projects. Stone began to replace mud brick in certain contexts, signalling ambition toward permanence. The concept of regnal years became more systematic. Events were named and counted according to the king's reign. This practice reinforced centralized chronology. Time itself became tied to kingship. Rather than referencing seasons alone, people referenced the years of a particular ruler. The Nile's flood, once the sole organizer of life, now shared that role with the king's authority. Agricultural cycles continued, but taxation, labor mobilization, and religious festivals were coordinated through centralized administration. The river still ruled in practical terms, but a human figure claimed to channel its stability. Narmer's unification set the stage for the Old Kingdom. Without centralized control, the construction of massive stone pyramids would have been impossible. Coordinating thousands of workers, sourcing materials from quarries, and transporting stone along the Nile required established bureaucracy. The foundation was laid in these early decades. As attention shifts forward, the evolution from early dynastic kingship to fully articulated divine monarchy becomes clear. The crown, first worn in symbolic triumph, would soon be associated with solar theology, monumental tombs, and expansive administrative systems. The throne that united two lands would become the axis around which an entire civilization revolved. By the time the memory of unification had settled into tradition, the office of the pharaoh had begun to expand beyond the practical authority of a ruler. What emerged in the centuries after Nama was not simply a stronger monarchy, but a theological framework that placed the king at the centre of the universe. The structure of Egyptian society did not separate religion from governance. The two developed together, reinforcing one another until the pharaoh's identity became inseparable from divine order. To understand why the pharaoh was never just a king, it is necessary to understand Ma'at. This concept is often translated as truth, justice, balance, or order, but none of those words alone capture its scope. Ma'at referred to the fundamental harmony of existence. It governed the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the fairness of judgment, and the stability of society. It was both cosmic principle and ethical standard. In Egyptian belief, the universe functioned properly only when Ma'at was upheld. The king's primary responsibility was to maintain Ma'at. This duty was not metaphorical. It was considered literal and ongoing. Temple walls from later periods depict the pharaoh presenting a small figure of the goddess Ma'at to other gods. This image represents the offering of order itself. The king did not merely worship the gods, he supplied them with balance. Without his ritual participation, chaos, known as Isfet, could encroach. The theological structure that elevated the pharaoh developed gradually during the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods. The king was associated with Horus, the falcon god linked with kingship and the sky. In life, the pharaoh was Horus incarnate. Upon death, he became associated with Osiris, ruler of the underworld. This dual identification bridged earth and afterlife. The king's existence extended beyond physical lifespan. The pyramid texts, inscribed inside the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties, reveal how fully developed this divine ideology had become. These texts describe the deceased king ascending to the heavens, joining the circumpolar stars, and travelling with the sun god Ra across the sky. The afterlife of the pharaoh was not a passive resting state. It was active participation in cosmic cycles. His continued vitality ensured the ongoing stability of Egypt. This divine blueprint shaped architecture. The step pyramid of Djoser, constructed under the direction of the architect Imhotep, represents a shift toward monumental stone building. It was not merely a tomb, it was a symbolic ladder to the sky. Later pyramids refined the form into smooth-sided structures aligned with cardinal directions. Their placement on the west bank of the Nile connected them with the setting sun and the realm of the dead. Construction of these monuments required coordination at a scale previously unseen. Quarries were organised. Labour forces were mobilised seasonally during inundation. Food and housing were supplied to workers. The king's divine role justified the allocation of immense resources. Building his eternal house was considered an act of national significance. Temples also embodied the divine kingship model. Although many Old Kingdom temples have not survived as completely as later examples, the principle was established early. The temple was the dwelling place of a god. Daily rituals within it sustained divine presence. The pharaoh, as high priest of every temple, was theoretically responsible for all ceremonies. In practice, priests carried out rituals, but always in the king's name. The king's titulary reflects this theology. A full royal name included multiple components: the Horus name, the Nebti name invoking the two ladies of Upper and Lower Egypt, the Golden Horus name, and later the throne name and birth name enclosed in cartouches. Each element connected the ruler to divine forces and geographic unity. These names were not decorative additions, they were declarations of identity. The said festival, celebrated after 30 years of reign, and periodically thereafter provides insight into how kingship was renewed. During this jubilee, the pharaoh performed rituals demonstrating physical vigour, symbolically running between markers representing Upper and Lower Egypt. The festival reaffirmed his ability to rule and maintain order. Even aging kings participated, reinforcing continuity. Artistic representation reinforced divinity. The pharaoh was depicted in idealized form, youthful and composed regardless of actual age. Proportions followed strict canon. Scale signified importance. Enemies were shown smaller, chaotic and disordered. The king's image conveyed stability. Repetition of this imagery across temples and tombs created visual consistency, linking rulers across generations. Divinity also manifested in law and justice. While no complete legal code survives from the Old Kingdom, inscriptions indicate that the king was the ultimate judge. Officials acted on his behalf. Justice was framed as restoration of Ma'at. When disputes were resolved, they were resolved in alignment with cosmic balance. Authority over law reinforced sacred responsibility. The economy functioned within this divine structure. Land was technically owned by the crown. Agricultural production supported temples and royal estates. Redistribution of goods flowed through administrative channels connected to the palace. The king's control over resources was presented as stewardship rather than ownership. He maintained prosperity for the gods and the people. Foreign relations further amplified divine identity. Inscriptions describing military campaigns depict the pharaoh smiting enemies under divine protection. Victory was not portrayed solely as strategic success. It was evidence that the gods favoured Egypt's ruler. Conversely, defeat or instability could be interpreted as disruption of cosmic balance. The solar cult gained prominence during the 4th and 5th dynasties. Kings increasingly associated themselves with Ra, the sun god. Royal names incorporated references to the sun. Solar temples were constructed. The king's divine identity expanded from Horus alone to include direct affiliation with Ra. This shift elevated the pharaoh's status even further. He was not merely chosen by the gods, he was their son. This theological expansion influenced burial practices for elites as well. While earlier emphasis centered on the king's afterlife, officials began to include more elaborate funerary provisions in their own tombs. The democratization of certain afterlife concepts did not diminish the king's primacy. Instead, it extended the cosmic order he maintained to broader society. The divine blueprint also shaped language. Hieroglyphic inscriptions frequently include formulaic phrases invoking the king's life, prosperity, and health. These expressions were not casual wishes. They reinforced belief that the ruler's well-being was linked directly to national stability. The phrase life, prosperity, health appears repeatedly, connecting physical vitality with cosmic order. At the same time, the king remained human. Evidence of administrative records reveals concerns with resource management, quarry expeditions, and labour organisation. Letters and reliefs hint at ageing, illness, and succession planning. The divine identity did not eliminate practical governance. It framed it within sacred context. Succession was critical to maintaining divine continuity. The transfer of power from one king to the next had to be presented as seamless. Even if internal conflict occurred, official records emphasized legitimacy. The heir became Horus at the moment of accession. Ritual transformation reinforced this shift. The body of the deceased king was mummified and entombed as Osiris, while the new king embodied Horus. The pyramid complexes illustrate this continuity. Causeways connected valley temples to mortuary temples and pyramids, forming ritual landscapes. Offerings continued long after burial. Priests maintained cults dedicated to deceased kings. Their names were recited. Their spirits were fed symbolically. Eternal maintenance of the king's cult reinforced belief that divine kingship transcended individual lifespan. During periods of strong centralized rule, This blueprint functioned effectively. Stability, agricultural success, and monumental building reinforced belief in the system. However, when central authority weakened at the end of the Old Kingdom, cracks appeared. Droughts and economic strain undermined confidence. Provincial governors gained power. The divine framework was challenged not through theological debate but through material reality. Even during fragmentation, however, the concept of divine kingship did not disappear. Competing rulers in different regions each claimed legitimate authority. They did not reject the blueprint, they adopted it. The persistence of this model across political upheaval demonstrates how deeply embedded it had become. In everyday life, the pharaoh's presence was both distant and pervasive. Most Egyptians would never see the king directly, yet his image appeared in temples and official buildings. Taxes were collected in his name, festivals were celebrated under his authority. The calendar itself was organized according to regnal years. His identity structured time. The Nile's annual flood remained the essential natural event shaping life. When the inundation arrived on schedule, it confirmed that Ma'at prevailed. In temple inscriptions, kings sometimes claimed responsibility for abundant floods. While they could not control rainfall in distant highlands, the narrative of divine kingship allowed natural phenomena to be integrated into political ideology. The concept of the king as divine mediator also influenced foreign perceptions. Neighbouring states addressed Egyptian rulers with respect, sometimes adopting Egyptian titulary and diplomatic correspondence. Tribute scenes depict foreign envoys presenting goods to the pharaoh. These scenes emphasize universal recognition of his status. Education of scribes included training in royal ideology. Instructional texts reinforced loyalty and reverence. Literature from later periods often idealized past kings as paragons of justice. Even when criticism appeared, it was framed as deviation from ideal kingship rather than rejection of the institution itself. The divine blueprint endured because it provided coherence. It linked environmental cycles, social hierarchy, and cosmic belief into a single narrative. The pharaoh was not only administrator and war leader, he was guarantor of existence. Removing him from that role would require dismantling the worldview itself. As the Old Kingdom matured, pyramid construction reached its peak at Giza under Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The scale of these monuments reflects supreme confidence in divine kingship. Alignments with celestial bodies, precision in engineering, and vast labour coordination underscore the strength of centralised belief. Yet even at its height, this system depended on balance. If administrative networks faltered or economic strain intensified, confidence could waver. The first intermediate period that followed demonstrated vulnerability. Still, when reunification occurred under the Middle Kingdom, rulers consciously revived earlier traditions, emphasizing continuity with divine models established centuries before. The pharaoh was never simply an individual occupying a throne. He was an office embedded in theology, ritual, economy, art, and landscape. His body symbolized unity of two lands. His actions were framed as cosmic maintenance. His death did not end responsibility, it transformed it. As the story continues into eras of monumental construction and expansive administration, the implications of this blueprint become increasingly visible. The divine identity shaped ambition, justified resource mobilization, and defined legacy. What began with unification under Nama evolved into a system where kingship itself was inseparable from the structure of the universe, setting the stage for the age when stone would be raised on an unprecedented scale to express that belief. By the time the Old Kingdom reached its height, the divine blueprint of kingship was no longer theoretical. It was carved into limestone, aligned with the cardinal points, and rising in geometric precision above the western horizon. The pharaoh's authority was expressed not only in titles and rituals, but in mass and scale. Stone became the chosen language of permanence, and the message it carried was unmistakable. The king ruled in life, and he would endure in death. The age of pyramids began not with smooth-sided giants at Giza, but with an experiment at Saqqara. Djoser, a 3rd dynasty ruler, commissioned a structure that transformed earlier mastaba tombs into a stepped pyramid. Designed by his vizier Imhotep, this monument marked a turning point. Instead of mud brick, it used quarried stone on an unprecedented scale. Instead of a single burial chamber beneath a flat roof, it stacked successively smaller mastabas to create elevation. This architectural innovation was more than aesthetic. It was theological. Height implied ascent. The stepped form suggested a stairway toward the sky. The pyramid complex surrounding it included courtyards, shrines, and ceremonial spaces. It was not merely a grave. It was a ritual landscape designed to sustain the king's afterlife and reinforce his divine role. Djoser's project required centralized coordination. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, and assembled. Labor forces were organized seasonally during inundation, when farming paused. Workers were housed in purpose-built villages, fed from state stores, and supervised by officials. This system demonstrates the administrative reach of the crown. Absolute power was not abstract. It functioned through logistics. Following Djoser, experimentation continued. Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty, oversaw multiple pyramid projects. The bent pyramid at Dashur reflects structural adjustments mid-construction, its angle changing partway up. The red pyramid, also at Dashur, achieved the first successful smooth-sided form. These efforts represent refinement through experience. Monumental ambition did not eliminate engineering challenges. It required adaptation. Under Khufu, pyramid building reached its most famous expression at Giza. The Great Pyramid, constructed with millions of limestone blocks, once rose over 140 metres. Its base aligns closely with true north. Internal chambers and passageways were carefully planned. The scale of the project remains impressive, even when stripped of mystery. It required quarrying stone from nearby and from Tura across the river, transporting it on barges, and coordinating thousands of workers over decades. Contrary to older assumptions, the workforce was not composed primarily of enslaved captives. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages at Giza indicates organised labour crews provided with rations of bread, beer, and meat. Inscriptions naming work gangs reflect pride and identity. These were Egyptians fulfilling state service, likely in rotating shifts. Their participation underscores the integration of economy and ideology. The pyramid was only one component of a larger complex. A valley temple at the edge of the Nile connected via causeway to the mortuary temple, adjacent to the pyramid. Offerings were presented daily. Priests maintained cult activities long after the king's death. The entire arrangement functioned as a machine of eternity, ensuring that the pharaoh's ka, or life force, remained nourished. Absolute power during the 4th dynasty extended beyond construction. The crown controlled extensive estates. Agricultural production supported temple foundations and administrative centres. Royal family members and trusted officials held high positions. The central government managed trade expeditions to acquire cedar from Lebanon, turquoise from Sinai, and gold from Nubia. Military presence secured borders and protected trade routes. Khafra and Menkaure continued the Giza program, constructing their own pyramids nearby. Khafra's complex includes the Great Sphinx, carved from bedrock and bearing the king's likeness in idealized form. The Sphinx, positioned near the causeway, reinforced solar associations. Its lion body symbolized strength. Its human head linked power with intellect and divine authority. The uniformity of pyramid construction across generations reflects confidence in centralized rule. Each king sought to surpass or match his predecessor in scale and precision. Competition within continuity strengthened the institution. The king's eternal house was a statement of his place in an unbroken chain. The solar cult grew increasingly influential during this period. 5th dynasty rulers emphasized their connection to Ra more explicitly. Solar temples constructed at Abusir featured open courts and obelisks symbolizing the sun's rays. While pyramid size gradually decreased, theological complexity expanded. The king was not only Horus and son of Ra, but participant in the sun's daily journey. Pyramid texts carved into burial chambers beginning with Una's mark a shift in funerary literature. These spells describe ascent, transformation, and union with the gods. They're inscribed directly onto stone walls, merging language with architecture. Writing itself became part of the mechanism ensuring immortality. The absolute power of the pharaoh in this era depended on maintaining economic stability. Flood levels were recorded and monitored. Grain was stored and redistributed. Administrative records, though fragmentary, revealed detailed oversight of resources. Officials were appointed to oversee nomes and report to the central authority. Loyalty to the crown was reinforced through burial proximity and honorific titles. Artistic conventions reached high refinement. Statues of Khafra carved from diorite depict the king seated with Horus as falcon behind his head, wings enveloping him protectively. The expression is serene, detached from strain. Even in stone, the image communicates unshakable authority. Yet this era of monumental achievement also contained seeds of vulnerability. The resources devoted to pyramid construction were immense. As pyramid size diminished in later 5th and 6th dynasties, it may reflect economic adjustments. Provincial elites began constructing larger tombs for themselves. Reliefs in their mastabas depict agricultural scenes, workshops and daily life, emphasizing their own status. The decentralization that emerged toward the end of the Old Kingdom did not happen suddenly. Over time, nomarchs gained hereditary control over their regions. Wealth accumulated locally. When prolonged low Nile floods occurred, possibly linked to climatic fluctuations, central authority struggled to respond effectively. Famine and instability challenged the narrative of unbroken Maat. The 6th dynasty, particularly under Pepi II, illustrates the strain of extended reign. Pepi II reportedly ruled for decades, perhaps over 60 years. While longevity could signal stability, it also meant that succession planning became complex. As central administration weakened, provincial governors asserted autonomy. The divine aura of the pharaoh could not entirely shield the institution from material pressures. Despite decline, the ideological framework endured. Even during the first intermediate period, when Egypt fractured into competing regions, rulers in both north and south adopted royal titulary and imagery. They did not abandon the model of divine kingship. They competed within it. The Age of Pyramids remains a defining chapter because it represents the most concentrated expression of absolute power in stone. It demonstrates what centralized authority, combined with theological certainty, could achieve. It also reveals limits. Monumental scale did not guarantee perpetual stability. When the Old Kingdom gave way to fragmentation, later rulers would look back to this era as a golden age. Middle Kingdom kings consciously revived Old Kingdom artistic styles and emphasized continuity with earlier dynasties. The memory of pyramid builders became part of national identity. The Nile continued its annual cycle throughout these shifts. It flooded and receded, indifferent to administrative changes. When floods were sufficient, recovery followed. When they were not, hardship intensified. Environmental forces interacted with political structures in ways that no amount of theology could fully control. As attention turns toward the first intermediate period and eventual reunification under the Middle Kingdom, the contrast becomes clear. The age of monumental pyramids and unchallenged authority yielded to a time when divine kingship had to be reasserted. The blueprint remained intact, but its application required renewal. The pyramids stand today as physical evidence of belief translated into architecture. They testify to a society capable of organizing vast labor under centralized command. They also serve as reminders that power, no matter how absolute it appears, operates within environmental and economic realities. The next phase of this unfolding story examines what happened when the balance faltered, when divine kingship faced strain, and how new rulers reshaped authority in response. For generations, the Old Kingdom had presented an image of stability that seemed unshakable. Stone pyramids rose with mathematical precision. Reliefs showed the king smiting enemies and offering mayat to the gods. Administrative systems moved grain from field to storage, and from storage to temple. The ideology was clear. As long as the pharaoh upheld order, the land would prosper. Yet toward the end of the Sixth Dynasty, the machinery that supported that vision began to strain, and the cause was not invasion or sudden rebellion. It was something quieter and more difficult to confront. The Nile's flood, which had always been reliable enough to sustain agriculture, appears to have faltered. Geological and climatological studies suggest that around 2200 BCE, a broader climatic shift affected large parts of the ancient world. In Egypt, this meant lower inundation levels for consecutive years. When the flood was weak, the fertile silt did not spread widely across fields. Crops failed, surplus diminished. Famine became a possibility rather than an abstraction. Under normal conditions, the central administration could redistribute grain from prosperous regions to those in need. But prolonged low floods reduced overall production. The stores that had once seemed abundant began to shrink. The pharaoh, whose legitimacy rested on maintaining mayat, faced a crisis that could not be resolved by ritual alone. The divine blueprint assumed harmony between king and cosmos. Drought disrupted that assumption. Pepi II, one of the last major rulers of the Old Kingdom, reigned for an exceptionally long time. While long reigns could signal continuity, they also risked administrative fatigue. Officials appointed early in his rule aged and died. Succession planning grew complicated. Power accumulated in provincial hands as local governors managed resources in their own regions. The central government's ability to enforce directives weakened. Provincial elites, known as nomarchs, began constructing increasingly elaborate tombs in their own territories rather than near the royal capital. Their reliefs emphasized local authority and generosity, describing how they fed their people during times of scarcity. These inscriptions do not directly accuse the king of failure, but they subtly reposition responsibility. The nomarch presents himself as protector when floods are insufficient. The image of the pharaoh as sole guarantor of order becomes less absolute. Administrative decentralization accelerated. Tax collection became inconsistent. Labor mobilization for large state projects declined. Pyramid construction had already diminished in scale during the 5th and 6th dynasties, reflecting economic adjustments. Now even maintenance of royal mortuary cults may have suffered. Priestly endowments relied on agricultural income. If yields declined, sustaining rituals became more difficult. The theological system did not collapse immediately. Belief in the divine role of kingship persisted. However, when famine threatened survival, practical concerns overshadowed ideology. Letters and later literary texts such as the Admonitions of Epure, though composed in later periods, reflect a cultural memory of chaos associated with this era. They describe a world turned upside down, where social order falters and security is uncertain. The first intermediate period that followed was not a single dramatic overthrow. It was a gradual fragmentation. Competing rulers emerged in Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt. Each claimed legitimacy. Each adopted royal titulary. Instead of rejecting the model of divine kingship, they replicated it in parallel. The concept of unity fractured, but the framework endured. Environmental stress likely exacerbated political rivalry. When resources are scarce, competition intensifies. Local leaders who could secure grain and protect their communities gained loyalty. The crown's inability to guarantee abundance weakened centralized authority. The divine king, associated with the Nile's generosity, appeared less omnipotent when the river failed to rise adequately. Archaeological evidence from settlements suggests economic contraction. Some regions show signs of abandonment or reduced activity. Trade networks diminished. Imports from the Levant and Nubia decreased. When surplus vanished, long-distance exchange became harder to sustain. Egypt turned inward, focused on local survival. It is important to note that this collapse was not uniform across the entire country. Some regions appear to have fared better than others. The Nile did not fail everywhere equally. Variation in flood levels could create pockets of relative stability. This uneven impact contributed to the rise of regional powers. Where central administration faltered, local leadership filled the gap. Artistic styles shifted during this period. Relief carving became less standardized. Tomb inscriptions emphasized personal piety and local identity. Literature from later Middle Kingdom compositions reflects on the instability of the time, portraying it as a moral and social crisis. These narratives may exaggerate conditions for dramatic effect, but they indicate a remembered disruption of order. The role of the king during drought raises a fundamental question within the divine blueprint. If the pharaoh is responsible for maintaining Ma'at, what happens when natural forces undermine prosperity? The answer during the Old Kingdom's decline was not theological abandonment, but political reconfiguration. Authority dispersed. Kingship did not disappear, it multiplied. Heracleopolitan rulers controlled parts of Lower Egypt, while Theban rulers gradually consolidated Upper Egypt. Conflict between these factions likely occurred intermittently. Military campaigns and alliances shaped the landscape. The struggle was not only for territory, but for the right to embody legitimate kingship. The economic structure that had supported pyramid construction proved less adaptable to prolonged environmental stress. Monumental building requires surplus. When grain yields decline, priorities shift towards subsistence. Labour once devoted to state projects returns to fields and local infrastructure. The visual language of absolute power becomes harder to maintain. Yet even amid fragmentation, cultural continuity persisted. Religious practices continued. Burial customs evolved rather than disappeared. The coffin texts, which expanded upon earlier pyramid texts, began to appear in non-royal burials. Access to afterlife spells broadened beyond the king. This democratization of religious knowledge may reflect changing social structures, but it also indicates resilience. The Theban rulers eventually gained advantage. Mentuhotep II, ruling from Thebes, embarked on campaigns to reunify Egypt. By around 2055 BCE, he had defeated rival factions and restored centralized authority. His reign marks the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. In temple reliefs, he is depicted wearing both crowns, reasserting unity. The reunification did not erase memory of collapse. Middle Kingdom kings were conscious of the fragility of order. They emphasized restoration. Inscriptions describe bringing Ma'at back to the land, feeding the hungry and stabilizing administration. Lessons drawn from the Old Kingdom's decline informed new policies. Provincial governors were monitored more closely. Royal oversight was strengthened. Environmental conditions likely improved gradually, allowing agricultural recovery. With more stable floods, economic growth resumed. Centralized control could once again mobilize resources for building projects, though on a different scale than the Fourth Dynasty pyramids. Instead of colossal stone mountains, Middle Kingdom rulers invested in fortified towns, irrigation improvements, and more modest pyramids. The Old Kingdom's quiet collapse illustrates the limits of absolute power. Theology could frame the king as divine mediator, but it could not command rainfall in distant highlands. When environmental stress intersected with administrative decentralization, the system faltered. Yet the concept of divine kingship proved adaptable. It survived fragmentation and informed restoration. The Nile remained central to this story. Its annual flood had always been the foundation of prosperity. When it weakened, the impact rippled through every layer of society. The god king could perform rituals, but he depended on natural cycles. The interplay between environment and ideology shaped the trajectory of Egyptian history. As stability returned under Middle Kingdom rulers, the memory of drought and division lingered. Kingship would never again be expressed solely through monumental excess. Instead, governance incorporated lessons about regional balance and administrative oversight. The divine blueprint was not discarded, it was recalibrated. The period that follows reunification reveals a renewed emphasis on effective administration, military organisation, and economic expansion. The throne once again claimed to unite two lands, but it did so with awareness of previous vulnerability. The next stage in this unfolding narrative examines how Middle Kingdom rulers rebuilt authority and redefined what it meant to govern a land shaped by river and memory. When Mentuhotep II emerged from Thebes and gradually brought the rival factions of Egypt under his control, he did not present himself as a conqueror, establishing something entirely new. He framed his reign as restoration. The two lands had been divided. Maat had weakened. Now unity was returning. This language was deliberate. It acknowledged fragmentation without conceding that divine kingship had failed. Instead, it positioned the new ruler as the one who repaired what had been strained. The Middle Kingdom began not with the same monumental excess that defined the Fourth Dynasty, but with consolidation. Mentuhotep II's mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri differs from earlier pyramid complexes. It combines rock-cut elements with terraced architecture. Its design integrates the natural cliffs behind it. The structure signals continuity with tradition, yet also innovation. The message is subtle, but clear. Authority has been restored, and it has adapted. The Middle Kingdom kings recognized that the decentralization of the First Intermediate period had empowered provincial elites. Nomarchs had become entrenched in their regions, sometimes holding hereditary positions that rivaled royal authority. To prevent recurrence, the crown gradually reduced the autonomy of these officials. Some nomarch families were replaced, others were integrated into the royal administration under closer supervision. The capital eventually shifted to Ichtawi under Amenemhat I of the 12th dynasty. Its precise location remains uncertain, but it was likely positioned strategically between Upper and Lower Egypt. Establishing a new administrative centre symbolised a fresh beginning. It also placed the king geographically closer to regions that had previously challenged centralised control. Amenemhat I's reign marks a conscious effort to redefine kingship. Literary works from the Middle Kingdom, such as the Instructions of Amenemhat, though composed later, reflect an awareness of political vulnerability. In this text, the king warns his successor about betrayal and the necessity of vigilance. Whether or not the account reflects a historical assassination attempt, it conveys a shift in tone. The king is divine, but he is also aware of human risk. The co-regency system introduced during the 12th dynasty represents another adaptation. Kings began appointing their successors as co-rulers during their own lifetimes. This practice aimed to ensure smoother transitions and prevent power struggles. By sharing authority before death, the continuity of divine kingship was reinforced. Succession became more controlled. Senusret I, successor to Amenemhat I, expanded Egypt's reach into Nubia. Fortresses constructed along the Second Cataract secured trade routes and monitored movement. These fortifications demonstrate a more organised military presence than earlier periods. Control over Nubia meant access to gold mines and trade networks reaching deeper into Africa. Economic strength supported political stability. Middle Kingdom rulers invested heavily in irrigation and land reclamation projects, particularly in the Fayum region. By regulating water flow and expanding cultivable land, they increased agricultural output. These efforts reveal practical governance informed by memory of drought. The king's responsibility to maintain Ma'at now included proactive environmental management. Pyramid construction continued during the Middle Kingdom, but at reduced scale compared to Giza. The pyramids of Amenemhat and Senusret rulers were built primarily with mud brick cores and limestone casing. Their dimensions were smaller, yet they adhered to traditional layout: valley temple, causeway, mortuary temple. The symbolism endured even as economic priorities shifted. Administrative reform characterized the period. Officials were often appointed from outside local power bases to reduce hereditary entrenchment. The vizier's office became more structured. Written documentation expanded. Papyrus records from sites like Lahun revealed detailed accounts of labour assignments, rations, and construction oversight. Bureaucracy became more sophisticated. Religion evolved alongside governance. The cult of Osiris gained broader prominence, emphasizing personal salvation and moral accountability. The afterlife was no longer exclusive to the king. Coffin texts appeared in elite burials, expanding access to spells once reserved for royalty. This shift did not undermine the king's divinity. Instead, it integrated royal theology into wider society. Literature flourished during the Middle Kingdom. Stories such as the Tale of Sinuhe explore themes of loyalty, exile, and return. The protagonist's journey away from Egypt and eventual reintegration reinforces the idea that stability lies within the ordered realm of the king. These narratives served both artistic and ideological purposes. Trade networks expanded. Expeditions to Punt brought incense, ebony, and exotic goods. Quarrying operations in Sinai secured copper and turquoise. Contact with the Levant continued. Economic engagement beyond Egypt's borders contributed to prosperity and reinforced the king's image as provider. The image of kingship during this period reflects both continuity and recalibration. Statues of Senusret III depict a ruler with lined face and sombre expression. Unlike the eternally youthful representations of earlier dynasties, these images suggest experience and burden. The king remains divine, but he is shown as vigilant and aware. Military campaigns into Nubia and the Levant reinforced Egypt's borders. Fortresses in Nubia were not only defensive structures, they were administrative hubs regulating trade and migration. Egyptian presence in these regions extended cultural influence. Control of frontier zones strengthened internal security. The Middle Kingdom also invested in internal infrastructure. Towns such as Kahun, built to house workers on royal projects, exhibit organised street grids and planned layouts. This level of planning indicates state capacity to design and manage communities systematically. The role of the pharaoh as mediator between gods and people remained central. Temple construction continued, though not at the monumental scale of later New Kingdom projects. Ritual practice maintained continuity with earlier traditions. Offerings, festivals, and priestly duties reinforced the sacred dimension of governance. When Amenemhat III undertook extensive projects in the Fayum, including construction of the so-called labyrinth described by later Greek writers, it demonstrated both administrative capability and architectural ambition. Harnessing the lake's water levels required engineering knowledge and coordinated labour. Prosperity under his reign reflects effective management. Despite renewed strength, the Middle Kingdom was not immune to external pressures. Toward the end of the 12th dynasty and into the 13th, central authority weakened gradually. A series of short reigns suggests instability. Asiatic groups, later known as Hyksos, began settling in the eastern delta. Their presence was initially commercial, but over time it became political. The second intermediate period that followed saw division once more, with Hyksos rulers controlling parts of Lower Egypt while Theban kings held Upper Egypt. The lessons of the previous collapse were tested again. Yet the Middle Kingdom's administrative sophistication provided a template for eventual reunification. The reinvention of authority during the Middle Kingdom lies in its balance. Kingship remained divine, but it incorporated practical reforms. Co-regency reduced succession crises. Administrative restructuring limited regional autonomy. Economic expansion supported stability. The memory of drought-shaped policy. The pharaoh was no longer expressed primarily through overwhelming monumentality. Instead, his authority was demonstrated through effective governance and territorial security. The divine blueprint adapted to circumstances. It absorbed the experience of collapse and re-emerged with reinforced foundations. As the Hyksos period introduced new military technologies such as horse-drawn chariots and composite bows, Egypt would face a different kind of challenge. The stage was set for another reunification under rulers who would carry Middle Kingdom lessons into a new era of expansion. The next development in this unfolding narrative centres on how foreign occupation reshaped Egyptian identity and how a new line of pharaohs transformed defence into empire. When the rulers of Thebes finally expelled the Hyksos from the Nile Delta, the restoration of unity did not lead back to cautious consolidation. It led outward. The memory of foreign occupation had altered Egypt's sense of vulnerability. The Hyksos had introduced new military technologies, including the horse-drawn chariot and more advanced composite bows. They had ruled parts of Lower Egypt for generations. The lesson was clear. If Egypt remained passive, others would shape its destiny. The response was transformation. Amos I, founder of the 18th dynasty, led the final campaigns against the Hyksos stronghold at Avaris. Inscriptions from soldiers such as Amos, son of Abana, describe naval engagements and sieges. These records provide rare insight into the mechanics of warfare. Rewards were given for valour, spoils were distributed, military service became a path to status. The pharaoh stood at the head of this effort, not only as divine mediator, but as commander. The new kingdom that followed marked a decisive shift in royal identity. The king remained responsible for Maat, but now that responsibility extended beyond the Nile Valley, defence turned into preemptive expansion. Campaigns into Nubia secured gold mines and trade routes. Expeditions into the Levant established buffer zones against potential threats. Empire replaced isolation. Thutmose I pushed south into Nubia and north towards Syria. Reliefs depict him smiting enemies beneath divine symbols. His successors expanded further. Thutmose III, often called one of Egypt's greatest military leaders, conducted numerous campaigns into Canaan and Syria. The Battle of Megiddo, recorded in detail on temple walls at Karnak, demonstrates logistical planning and strategic coordination. These inscriptions describe marching routes, siege tactics, and the collection of tribute. Cities were subdued and required to provide goods, livestock and hostages. Egyptian garrisons were stationed in key locations. Rather than annexing territories directly, Egypt established a system of vassal states. Local rulers retained authority under Egyptian oversight, paying tribute and swearing loyalty. This model of imperial control required constant maintenance. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Amarna letters reveals communication between Egyptian pharaohs and Near Eastern kings. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian, discuss marriages, trade, and requests for military assistance. The pharaoh appears as a participant in an international system of great powers. Expansion brought wealth. Tribute from Syria and Nubia included gold, silver, lapis lazuli, cedar wood, and exotic animals. This influx funded temple construction and supported priestly institutions. The cult of Amun at Thebes gained extraordinary influence during this period. Victories were attributed to the favour of Amun, reinforcing the connection between military success and divine endorsement. Temples became larger and more elaborate. Karnak expanded into a vast complex of pylons, obelisks, and hypostyle halls. Each campaign added inscriptions celebrating triumph. The pharaoh's role as warrior was carved into stone repeatedly. Scenes of smiting enemies became standardized. The king appears larger than life, gripping captives by the hair, ready to strike. The imagery reinforced dominance. Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh in her own right, provides an instructive variation. Though her reign emphasized trade expeditions, particularly to Punt, she maintained the iconography of kingship. She adopted traditional regalia, including the false beard. Her inscriptions present her rule as divinely sanctioned. Even without extensive warfare, the framework of royal authority remained intact. The warrior identity intensified under Thutmose III, and later under Seti I and Rameses II. Rameses II's campaigns against the Hittites culminated in the Battle of Kadesh. Though the battle ended inconclusively, inscriptions portray it as heroic victory. The king is depicted alone in his chariot, surrounded by enemies saved by divine support. The narrative elevates his personal bravery. The peace treaty that followed Kadesh represents one of the earliest recorded international agreements. Copies were inscribed in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. This treaty demonstrates a shift from constant warfare to diplomatic balance between great powers. The pharaoh as warrior also became pharaoh as negotiator. Imperial administration required oversight of distant territories. Egyptian officials supervised tribute collection. Princes from vassal states were brought to Egypt for education, fostering loyalty. This system extended cultural influence. Egyptian art and religious motifs spread into Nubia and the Levant. At the same time, foreign goods and ideas entered Egypt. The New Kingdom military relied heavily on chariots and infantry units. Specialized divisions were named after major gods such as Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. This organization linked warfare with religious symbolism. Soldiers marched under divine banners. Victory reinforced the narrative that the gods supported Egypt's expansion. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings replaced pyramid construction. These rock-cut tombs concealed elaborate burial chambers deep within cliffs. Wall paintings depict the journey through the underworld, based on texts such as the Amduat and the Book of Gates. The afterlife remained central, but architectural focus shifted towards secrecy and decoration, rather than monumental exterior form. The wealth generated by empire allowed unprecedented artistic flourishing. Colossal statues of Amenhotep III, including the so-called Colossi of Memnon, project confidence. Reliefs from Medinet Habu under Rameses III depict battles against the Sea Peoples. Each carving reinforces the king's role as defender against chaos. However, expansion carried costs. Maintaining garrisons and conducting campaigns required resources. When central authority weakened or economic strain increased, holding distant territories became difficult. The late 19th and 20th dynasties show signs of internal tension. Worker strikes recorded at Deir el-Medina reveal delayed rations and administrative disruption. Rameses III faced invasions from the Sea Peoples, a coalition of maritime groups. Inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe decisive victories, but these conflicts strained Egypt's resources. After his reign, imperial control diminished gradually. Territories in Syria and Canaan were lost. Nubian influence fluctuated. Despite decline, the image of the warrior king endured. Later pharaohs continued to depict themselves smiting enemies, even when actual campaigns were limited. The legend of earlier conquerors shaped expectations. Kingship had incorporated martial prowess as a defining element. The expansionist phase of the New Kingdom altered Egypt's identity. The Nile Valley was no longer the sole horizon. Egyptian authority extended into foreign lands. Trade and tribute enriched temples and cities. Cultural exchange intensified. The pharaoh stood at the center of this outward-facing empire. Religion adapted to imperial scale. The cult of Amun reached immense wealth. High priests wielded influence rivaling that of the king. This concentration of temple power would later contribute to fragmentation. For now, however, military success reinforced the sacred dimension of kingship. As the New Kingdom matured, internal and external pressures converged. Succession disputes, economic challenges, and shifting trade patterns affected stability. The warrior model that had defined the era could not prevent gradual contraction. Yet the legend of expansion remained embedded in collective memory. The next phase in this unfolding account examines a dramatic deviation within the New Kingdom itself. A ruler would attempt to redirect religious focus away from established cults toward a singular solar deity, challenging entrenched institutions. The consequences would ripple through art, theology and politics, reshaping the image of Pharaoh in unexpected ways. In a system that had for centuries presented kingship in unmistakably masculine form, the rise of Hatshepsut did not overturn tradition. It adapted it. She did not reject the symbols of pharaonic authority. She adopted them fully, including the false beard, the kilt, and the formal titulary that had defined kings before her. The question was never whether Egypt could be ruled by a woman in practice. It was whether the institution of divine kingship could incorporate her without fracture. The answer unfolded gradually and with careful calculation. Hatshepsut was born into the royal family of the 18th dynasty, daughter of Thutmose I. She married her half-brother Thutmose II, as was customary to preserve royal lineage. When Thutmose II died, the designated heir was Thutmose III, a child born to a secondary wife. Hatshepsut initially served as regent, acting on behalf of the young king. Regency was not unprecedented. What followed was. Within a few years, Hatshepsut assumed full royal titulary. She did not present herself merely as queen mother or consort. She adopted the throne name Matkare and began depicting herself in traditionally male regalia. Statues and reliefs show her wearing the Nemes headdress and ceremonial beard. Early in her reign, some images retained feminine form beneath royal attire. Later representations standardize her appearance into conventional masculine proportions. This transformation was not an attempt to conceal gender. It was a recognition that kingship was a role defined by established visual language. The divine blueprint required continuity. By presenting herself within that framework, Hatshepsut ensured that the institution remained intact. The emphasis was on office rather than biological distinction. Her legitimacy was reinforced through narrative. Reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict her divine birth. According to these scenes, the god Amun visited her mother in the guise of Thutmose I and conceived Hatshepsut directly. This account positioned her not only as rightful heir, but as child of a god. Divine parentage was not unique in Egyptian ideology, but its articulation here is unusually detailed and central. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari stands as one of the most distinctive architectural achievements of the New Kingdom. Terraced levels rise against the cliffs of western Thebes, connected by ramps and colonnades. The structure integrates harmoniously with the natural rock face. Its design reflects confidence and innovation. Scenes carved on its walls emphasize trade expeditions, offerings to Amun, and her divine birth narrative. One of the most significant undertakings of her reign was the expedition to Punt. Reliefs depict ships travelling to this distant land, returning with incense trees, myrrh, gold, ebony, and exotic animals. The emphasis is not on conquest, but on exchange. Punt is shown as a place of abundance rather than hostility. This narrative aligns with Hatshepsut's broader focus on prosperity and religious devotion, rather than constant warfare. Her reign did not lack military presence. Inscriptions mention campaigns in Nubia, and possibly in the Levant. However, compared to later rulers such as Thutmose III or Rameses II, her legacy centers on internal stability and economic strength. Monumental building projects flourished. Obelisks erected at Karnak proclaimed devotion to Amun and celebrated her achievements. The erection of obelisks served multiple purposes. These towering stone monuments symbolize solar rays and divine favor. Quarrying and transporting them from Aswan required logistical expertise. Their placement in temple precincts reinforced connection between ruler and god. Hatshepsut's obelisks at Karnak were among the tallest constructed to that date. Her relationship with the priesthood of Amun appears to have been cooperative. The wealth and influence of the temple complex at Karnak expanded during her reign. By aligning herself closely with Amun's cult, she strengthened both religious and political authority. This alliance provided ideological support. The coexistence of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III presents a nuanced picture. Thutmose III was not removed from succession. He appears in inscriptions and reliefs as co-ruler. However, during her lifetime, Hatshepsut dominated state affairs. After her death, Thutmose III embarked on extensive military campaigns, expanding Egyptian influence significantly. Years after Hatshepsut's death, many of her images and cartouches were altered or removed. Statues were broken or reinscribed. Her obelisks were partially walled in. The timing of these actions suggests they occurred during Thutmose III's later reign, or under Amenhotep II. The motives remain debated. They may reflect an effort to reinforce male succession lines rather than personal hostility. Despite attempts to diminish her visibility, archaeological evidence preserves her achievements. The survival of Deir el-Bahri's reliefs, fragments of statues and inscriptions ensures that her reign cannot be erased fully. Her use of established iconography, rather than rejection of it, may have contributed to institutional stability during her tenure. The adaptation of kingship under Hatshepsut demonstrates the flexibility of the divine blueprint. The office was strong enough to accommodate an unconventional occupant without structural collapse. By presenting herself as pharaoh in complete form, she avoided creating a parallel category. There was no separate model for female rule. There was only kingship. Her emphasis on trade and monumental architecture strengthened Egypt's economy and international standing. The wealth brought from Punt and Nubia funded temple projects and reinforced religious institutions. Stability under her rule allowed continuity before Thutmose III's expansionist campaigns. The narrative of divine birth and close association with Amun was central to her legitimacy. By embedding herself within theological tradition, she minimized grounds for opposition. The representation of her as male in official art served consistency rather than denial. The institution required recognizable symbols. She supplied them. Her reign illustrates how power could be expressed through building rather than conquest. The terraces of Deir el-Bahri, aligned with the valley's natural contours, communicate permanence. The temple's reliefs narrate her story in stone, emphasizing order and prosperity. The visual program is deliberate and cohesive. After her death, Thutmose III's campaign shifted focus outward. Yet he did not dismantle the administrative system she had overseen. The empire he expanded rested on foundations strengthened during her rule. The continuity between their reigns reflects institutional resilience. The question of why her memory was later targeted remains complex. Some scholars argue that her unprecedented assumption of full kingship disrupted succession narratives. Others suggest political motivations tied to consolidating Thutmose III's lineage. Whatever the reason, the effort to obscure her did not negate her impact. Hatshepsut's reign occupies a distinctive place within the New Kingdom. It reveals that kingship, though framed in masculine imagery, was fundamentally about role and legitimacy. The divine blueprint centered on maintaining Ma'at and sustaining connection with the gods. She fulfilled those expectations through stability, construction, and economic expansion. As the narrative continues into the reign of Thutmose III and subsequent rulers, the contrast between her relatively measured expansion and later aggressive campaigns becomes apparent. The throne she occupied remained powerful. The next phase in this unfolding story examines how expansion intensified once again under successors who carried Egypt's military presence to its widest extent. By the middle of the 18th dynasty, Egypt stood at the height of its wealth and international influence. The empire stretched deep into Nubia and far into the Levant. Tribute flowed into temple storehouses. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes controlled immense resources. The divine blueprint of kingship, refined over centuries, seemed firmly established. The pharaoh upheld Ma'at. The gods received offerings. The Nile flooded. Order prevailed. Into this stable framework stepped Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III. His early years gave little indication that his reign would diverge so sharply from tradition. He was raised within the conventional religious structure, where Amun held prominence among a broad pantheon of deities. Yet within a few years of ascending the throne, he initiated a transformation that would challenge the foundation of Egyptian theology. Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. The Aten was not a new deity. It had been worshipped previously as a manifestation of the sun's disk. What changed was emphasis. Under Akhenaten, the Aten was elevated above all other gods. Temples dedicated to Amun were closed or diminished. Images of traditional deities were defaced or removed. Official inscriptions increasingly referred only to the Aten. This shift was not subtle. It was systematic. The king ordered the construction of a new capital, Akhetaten, at a site now known as Amarna. The city was built rapidly on previously undeveloped land. Boundary stelae carved into surrounding cliffs proclaimed that the site was chosen by the Aten itself. The relocation distanced the court from Thebes and from the powerful Amun priesthood. The architecture of Akhetaten reflected theological innovation. Temples to the Aten were open to the sky, emphasizing direct exposure to sunlight. Unlike traditional temples, which contained dark inner sanctuaries housing cult statues, Aten temples centered on offering tables beneath open courtyards. The sun's rays, often depicted ending in hands, reached down to the royal family. Art underwent dramatic change during this period. The rigid conventions of proportion and idealized form softened. Reliefs show elongated limbs, narrow torsos, and intimate family scenes. Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti appear with their daughters beneath the sun disk, which extends rays tipped with ankhs, symbols of life. The imagery suggests a personal, almost exclusive relationship between the royal family and the Aten. This exclusivity was central. The Aten did not receive offerings from ordinary priests in dark sanctuaries. The king and his family acted as primary intermediaries. By redefining divine access, Akhenaten consolidated spiritual authority within the royal household. The traditional network of temples and priesthoods was bypassed. The theological language of the period reinforces this exclusivity. The great hymn to the Aten, inscribed in tombs at Amarna, describes the sun disk as creator and sustainer of all life. It praises the Aten's universal reach, providing light to foreign lands as well as Egypt. The hymn emphasizes natural processes rather than mythological narratives involving multiple gods. The suppression of Amun's cult carried political implications. The Amun priesthood had accumulated wealth and influence over generations. By redirecting religious focus, Akhenaten diminished their power. Some scholars interpret his reforms partly as an effort to reassert royal dominance over religious institutions. However, the changes extended beyond administrative restructuring. They altered daily religious practice. Traditional festivals, processions, and temple rituals were disrupted. Artisans, scribes, and priests accustomed to serving established deities faced uncertainty. The transformation affected both theology and economy. The international situation during Akhenaten's reign appears to have suffered from neglect. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and other Near Eastern states, reveal appeals from vassal rulers requesting military assistance. These letters suggest that Egypt's grip on its territories weakened during this period. Whether this resulted from diverted attention or broader instability remains debated. Akhenaten's reign lasted approximately 17 years. During that time, the new capital flourished briefly. Palaces, temples, and residential quarters were constructed with speed. Yet the city's existence was tied closely to the king's vision. When he died, the experiment began to unravel. His successor, initially named Tutankhaten, soon changed his name to Tutankhamun, restoring reference to Amun. The court returned to Thebes. Traditional temples reopened. The cult of the Aten was diminished. Reliefs and inscriptions from the Restoration period describe the land as having fallen into disorder under previous policies, emphasizing the need to re-establish Mayat. The erasure of Akhenaten's memory was systematic. His name was omitted from king lists. His monuments were dismantled. Blocks from Aten temples were reused in later constructions. This effort suggests that his reforms were viewed as disruptive enough to warrant deliberate removal from official history. Despite this, archaeological discoveries at Amarna preserve substantial evidence of his reign. The city's layout, domestic structures, and tomb reliefs provide rare insight into daily life at a royal capital. The artistic style remains distinctive, offering a brief departure from convention in the long arc of Egyptian art. The question of whether Akhenaten introduced true monotheism continues to be debated. Some scholars argue that Atenism functioned more as henotheism, elevating one god above others without denying their existence entirely. Others view it as a radical step towards singular devotion. What is clear is that it represented an unprecedented concentration of theological focus. The impact on the institution of kingship was significant. By redefining divine mediation exclusively through himself and his family, Akhenaten altered the relationship between pharaoh and priesthood. He did not diminish his own divinity, he intensified it. The Aten's light reached humanity primarily through the royal household. Yet the experiment proved fragile. Without broad institutional support, it could not endure beyond the originator's lifetime. The swift restoration under Tutankhamun and his successors indicates that the traditional religious framework remained deeply embedded in society. Akhenaten's reign stands as a rare moment when the pharaoh attempted to change not only policy or territory, but the gods themselves. The divine blueprint that had evolved over centuries was challenged from within. The response after his death demonstrates the resilience of established tradition. As the narrative advances beyond Amarna, the restoration period under Tutankhamun and later rulers reasserts conventional theology and reorients Egypt toward renewed military and architectural ambition. The memory of Akhenaten's son lingers as an anomaly, a brief interval when divine kingship was reshaped by a singular vision before returning to familiar form. When Akhenaten's experiment ended, Egypt did not immediately return to stability. The capital at Akhetaten still stood in the desert, temples to the Aten were still open to the sun, and the memory of suppressed gods lingered in damaged inscriptions. Into this uncertain landscape stepped a boy. Tutankhamun, born Tutankhaten, ascended the throne at around 9 years of age. His original name, meaning living image of the Aten, tied him directly to the religious reforms of his predecessor. Within a few years, that name changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The alteration was more than symbolic. It marked a deliberate reversal. The restoration stela, erected early in his reign, outlines the official narrative. It describes temples fallen into ruin, gods neglected and rituals disrupted. The land, according to the inscription, had turned away from divine favour. Tutankhamun is presented as the one who corrected these errors, who reopened sanctuaries, restored offerings, and re-established Mayat. The language carefully avoids direct condemnation of Akhenaten, but the implication is unmistakable. Given Tutankhamun's age, the practical execution of these policies likely rested with powerful advisors, notably the Vizier A and the General Horemheb. Yet the ideological weight remained attached to the king. The divine blueprint required a single figure through whom order was restored. Even a child could embody that role. The court relocated from Amarna back to Memphis and Thebes. Aten temples were dismantled or repurposed. Blocks carved with Akhenaten's distinctive relief style were reused as filler in later constructions. The priesthood of Amun regained prominence. The restoration was swift and systematic. Art returned to traditional conventions. The elongated forms and intimate family scenes of the Amarna period gave way to familiar proportions and formal poses. Reliefs from Tutankhamun's reign emphasize ritual continuity. The king is shown offering to multiple deities once again, reinforcing the restored pantheon. Temple building resumed at Karnak and Luxor. Inscriptions emphasize rebuilding rather than innovation. The emphasis was not on creating something new, but on repairing what had been disrupted. The king's role as mediator between gods and people was reasserted with clarity. International relations required attention as well. The Amarna letters indicate that Egypt's hold over some Levantine territories had weakened. Tutankhamun's reign shows limited evidence of large-scale campaigns, but diplomatic ties appear to have been re-established gradually. Stability at home took precedence over expansion abroad. The boy king's life was brief. He died around the age of 19. The cause of death remains debated, with studies of his mummy suggesting possible injury or illness. His early death created another succession challenge. One of his advisors succeeded him, followed by Horemheb. Tutankhamun's burial in the Valley of the Kings was modest compared to earlier pharaohs. His tomb, KV62, was small and likely not originally intended for a king. It may have been repurposed quickly due to his sudden death, yet the contents of that tomb transformed his legacy. In 1922, Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's largely intact tomb. The treasures inside, including the iconic gold funerary mask, gilded shrines, chariots, jewellery, and everyday objects, captured global attention. For the modern world, Tutankhamun became the most recognisable pharaoh. Ironically, his historical impact during his lifetime was limited compared to rulers like Thutmose III or Rameses II. The richness of the burial reflects continuity of royal funerary practice. Even during a period of restoration, the mechanisms of eternity remained intact. The king was mummified carefully. Amulets were placed within linen wrappings. The coffin nested within multiple shrines. Texts and images guided his journey through the underworld. The restoration of traditional religion under Tutankhamun was not merely administrative, it was theological reaffirmation. The gods were once again depicted in their full diversity. Offerings resumed. Festivals returned. The balance between priesthood and kingship was recalibrated. Who succeeded Tutankhamun, appears in reliefs performing the opening of the mouth ceremony for the deceased king, a ritual meant to restore the senses in the afterlife. This image underscores continuity. Despite political shifts, the sacred duties of kingship were observed. Horemheb, who followed undertook further measures to erase the Amarna period from official memory. King lists later compiled omit Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and compressing the timeline to emphasize continuity. Horemheb positioned himself as restorer of order, strengthening legal and administrative systems. The restoration stela provides insight into how the period was remembered officially. It frames Akhenaten's reign as one of neglect without naming him. It portrays temples as abandoned and gods as having turned away. Tutankhamun's actions are presented as corrective, bringing prosperity back to the land. Archaeological evidence suggests that the economic base of Egypt recovered gradually. Temple endowments were reinstated, trade networks resumed. The administration stabilized under Horemheb's reforms. By the time the 19th dynasty began, the state was poised for renewed military ambition. Tutankhamun's reign, though short, represents a pivot. It demonstrates that the divine blueprint could be restored after disruption. The office of pharaoh remained resilient. Even radical theological deviation could be reversed without dismantling the entire structure of kingship. The boy king's image endures largely because of his tomb's survival. His gold mask, serene and composed, conveys timeless authority. It reflects ideals established centuries earlier. The craftsmanship of his burial goods reveals the continuity of artistic and religious tradition. While his personal accomplishments were limited by age and circumstance, his reign marked the formal end of the Amarna experiment. The restoration of Amun's cult and the return to traditional worship signalled reaffirmation of long-standing beliefs. The balance between king, gods, and people was re-established. As the narrative progresses into the 19th dynasty, a new figure would embody the warrior-king image with renewed intensity. The throne, stabilized after theological upheaval, would once again project power outward. The restoration achieved under Tutankhamun and his successors set the stage for one of the most celebrated rulers in Egyptian history. By the time the 19th dynasty took firm hold of the throne, the turbulence of the Amarna period and the careful restoration that followed had given way to renewed confidence. The empire was intact, though tested. The priesthood of Amun was powerful but aligned once more with royal authority. Administrative systems had been reinforced under Horemheb. Into this landscape stepped a ruler whose reign would stretch across decades and whose name would be carved into more stone than almost any other in Egyptian history. Rameses II, often called Rameses the Great, ascended the throne as a young man, likely in his early 20s. He inherited a kingdom that required both strength and spectacle. From the beginning of his reign, he demonstrated mastery of both. His approach to kingship was not cautious. It was expansive, theatrical, and calculated to ensure permanence. Military ambition defined the early years of his rule. One of his most famous campaigns was the confrontation with the Hittite Empire at Kadesh. The Hittites controlled much of northern Syria, a region critical to Egypt's imperial interests. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in Ramesses' fifth regnal year, became one of the most extensively documented military engagements in the ancient world. Temple reliefs at Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, and Abu Simbel depict the battle in vivid detail. The narrative describes Ramesses advancing with divisions named after major gods. It portrays initial ambush by Hittite forces, followed by the king rallying his troops and charging into battle in his chariot. The reliefs show him alone amid enemies, arrows flying, horses rearing, divine protection surrounding him. Modern historians interpret the battle as inconclusive. Both sides claimed success, but neither achieved decisive dominance. Yet in Ramesses' inscriptions, the encounter becomes personal triumph. He is described as fearless, abandoned by troops, but saved by his own valour and the support of Amun. The official narrative transforms strategic stalemate into heroic legend. This transformation illustrates a defining characteristic of Ramesses' reign. He understood the power of narrative. By repeating his version of events across multiple monuments, he ensured that his interpretation became embedded in public memory. Stone was not only architectural material, it was medium of communication. The eventual peace treaty with the Hittites marked a significant diplomatic achievement. The treaty, inscribed in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, established mutual non-aggression and alliance. It is among the earliest surviving peace agreements. The document reflects a shift from open conflict to strategic balance between great powers. While military campaigns reinforced external strength, monumental buildings secured internal legacy. Ramesses II constructed extensively across Egypt. The Ramesseum at Thebes served as his mortuary temple, decorated with scenes of Kadesh and religious rituals. Colossal statues of the king dominated its entrance, projecting authority through scale. At Abu Simbel in Nubia, he commissioned two massive rock-cut temples. The larger temple features 4 seated colossi of Ramesses carved into the cliff face, each over 20 meters high. Inside, reliefs depict military victories and divine interactions. The smaller temple, dedicated to his queen Nefertari and the goddess Hathor, underscores the integration of royal family into sacred architecture. These monuments were not isolated projects. Ramesses also expanded temples at Karnak and Luxor, added to structures begun by predecessors, and established a new capital at Pi-Ramesses in the eastern delta. This city, built near earlier Hyksos strongholds, positioned the king closer to Asian territories and trade routes. The scale of construction required vast resources. Quarries operated at full capacity. Labour forces were organised through administrative networks refined in earlier dynasties. The wealth of empire, including tribute and trade goods, supported these endeavours. Ramesses' reign coincided with relative prosperity, enabling sustained building. His family life also became part of public narrative. Ramesses fathered numerous children, many of whom appear in temple reliefs. The depiction of princes and princesses alongside their father reinforced dynastic continuity. His chief queen Nefertari received a richly decorated tomb in the Valley of the Queens, with wall paintings considered among the finest in Egyptian art. Ramesses' long reign, spanning over 60 years, contributed to his legend. Few pharaohs ruled for such duration. Longevity allowed multiple generations to know only his authority. Stability under a single ruler reinforced perception of enduring strength. The administrative structure under Ramesses remained robust. Viziers managed Upper and Lower Egypt. Provincial governors oversaw local affairs. The military was organized into divisions and units with clear hierarchies. Temple institutions maintained religious continuity. However, the later years of his reign reveal strains beneath the surface. The costs of monumental construction and military campaigns were significant. Worker communities such as Deir el-Medina, responsible for royal tomb construction, left records indicating delayed rations during subsequent reigns. While these disruptions are documented more clearly under Ramesses III, the economic pressures likely began earlier. Ramesses II's emphasis on self-promotion extended to reinscribing earlier monuments with his own name. Statues and structures from previous reigns were sometimes appropriated. This practice was not unique to him, but he employed it extensively. The effect was cumulative. His name appeared across Egypt in association with achievements that spanned generations. Religiously, Ramesses maintained traditional devotion to Amun, Ra, and other deities. His titulary reinforced divine affiliation. Scenes of offering and ritual dominate temple walls. The warrior king image coexisted with priestly duty. Divine sanction underpinned military narrative. The peace with the Hittites was eventually strengthened by diplomatic marriage. A Hittite princess was sent to Egypt as part of alliance arrangements. This exchange underscores the complexity of New Kingdom diplomacy. The pharaoh was not solely conqueror. He was participant in international balance. As Ramesses aged, succession planning became pressing. Several of his sons predeceased him. Eventually, his 13th son, Meneptah, became heir. The longevity that enhanced Ramesses' legend also created generational challenges. After his death, Meneptah inherited a kingdom still formidable, but facing emerging threats. Inscriptions from his reign mention campaigns against Libyan groups and refer to Israel in one of the earliest extra-biblical references. The stability achieved under Ramesses did not guarantee permanence. Ramesses II's burial in the Valley of the Kings followed established New Kingdom practice. His mummy was later relocated to protect it from tomb robbers, eventually discovered in a royal cache at Deir el-Bahri. Even in death, his body was preserved carefully, reflecting enduring reverence. His legacy in later memory was substantial. Greek historians such as Herodotus referenced monumental structures attributed to him, though often with confusion regarding names. In Egyptian tradition, his reign represented strength and abundance. The repetition of his name in temple inscriptions across the land ensured lasting visibility. The phrase, "wrote his own eternity," reflects the deliberate crafting of narrative. Through relentless inscription and construction, Ramesses embedded his version of kingship into physical landscape. The monuments were not incidental expressions, they were instruments of memory. Yet as with earlier periods, the appearance of permanence did not eliminate vulnerability. After his death, internal pressures and external challenges intensified. The 20th dynasty faced invasions from the Sea Peoples and economic strain. The empire contracted gradually. Ramesses II stands at the apex of New Kingdom confidence. His reign encapsulates expansion, architectural ambition, and narrative mastery. The divine blueprint that began with early dynastic unification reached theatrical expression under his hand. As the narrative moves beyond his lifetime, attention shifts to the institutions that sustained his rule and the pressures that tested them. The monuments remain, but the forces shaping Egypt continued to evolve, setting the stage for gradual transformation in the centuries that followed. By the height of the New Kingdom, Egypt's landscape had become a network of sacred architecture. Temples lined the Nile at intervals, their pylons rising above riverbanks, their walls carved with reliefs of offering, conquest, and divine encounter. Across the western desert cliffs, hidden corridors descended into rock-cut tombs, walls painted with maps of the underworld. The institution of kingship was no longer expressed solely through a single pyramid or a single battlefield inscription. It operated through an interconnected system of structures designed to sustain eternity. The pharaoh's mortality was acknowledged from the moment of accession. While coronation rituals affirmed divine embodiment, preparations for burial often began early in a reign. Tomb construction in the Valley of the Kings required years of excavation and decoration. Teams of skilled artisans, organised into rotating crews, carved corridors deep into limestone cliffs. Their work was methodical, overseen by scribes and foremen who recorded progress, rations, and absences. The Valley of the Kings represented a shift in strategy from the visible pyramids of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. The monumental pyramid, while symbolically powerful, had become a target for tomb robbers. The New Kingdom's solution was concealment. Instead of raising stone mountains, rulers cut hidden passages into natural terrain. The cliffs themselves became guardians. Inside these tombs the walls were not left blank. They were covered in painted scenes derived from funerary texts. The Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, and later the Book of the Dead described the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld. The deceased king followed this path, encountering gates, guardians, and trials. Knowledge of these stages ensured safe passage. The burial chamber lay at the end of a descending sequence of corridors and halls. The sarcophagus, often carved from granite, housed nested coffins containing the mummified body. Amulets were placed carefully among linen wrappings. Each object had symbolic function. Scarabs represented rebirth. The Djed pillar symbolized stability. The Ankh signified life. Mummification itself was a complex process refined over centuries. Internal organs were removed and preserved in canopic jars, each protected by a deity. The body was dried with natron, wrapped in layers of linen, and anointed with oils. The aim was preservation, not simply for appearance, but for continued existence. The car required a recognizable vessel. While tombs ensured the king's transition into the afterlife, temples maintained his divine role in perpetuity. Mortuary temples built along the West Bank served as centres of cult activity. Priests presented offerings daily, reciting formulae that sustained the deceased ruler's spirit. These rituals were not symbolic gestures. They were considered essential for maintaining cosmic balance. Major temple complexes such as Karnak and Luxor extended beyond mortuary function. They were living institutions housing priesthoods, storing wealth, and hosting festivals. The annual Apet festival, for example, involved the ceremonial transport of a moon statue between Karnak and Luxor. The pharaoh participated, reinforcing his bond with the deity. The architecture of these temples followed a recognizable pattern. Massive pylons marked entrances, courtyards open to the sky. Hypostyle halls filled with columns led to increasingly restricted inner sanctuaries. The progression from public space to sacred interior mirrored social hierarchy. Only select priests entered the darkest chambers where cult statues resided. Relief carvings covered temple walls. Scenes of the king offering to gods were repeated in formal poses. Military victories were recorded. Rituals were depicted with precision. The imagery was cumulative. Each edition reinforced continuity with predecessors. Even when a new ruler recarved earlier names, the format remained consistent. Temple estates controlled significant economic resources. Land grants provided agricultural revenue. Workshops produced goods for ritual and redistribution. Priests oversaw granaries and livestock. The machinery of immortality extended into economic administration. Sustaining a divine cult required material support. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes became especially influential during the New Kingdom. Wealth accumulated through royal endowments and foreign tribute. High priests held positions of authority that at times rivaled the king's own. Cooperation between throne and temple was essential for stability. Artisans at Deir el-Medina, responsible for constructing and decorating royal tombs, lived in a planned village on the West Bank. Ostraca and papyri recovered from the site provide detailed records of daily life. They reveal strikes over delayed rations, personal disputes, and devotional practices. Even within the machinery of eternity, human concerns persisted. Royal tomb robbery became a serious problem during later periods. Papyrus records from the 20th dynasty detail investigations into looted tombs. Officials interrogated suspects and documented recovered items. The necessity of protecting burial sites underscores the tension between monumental legacy and material vulnerability. The Valley of the Queens housed tombs for royal wives and princes. These tombs, though smaller than those of kings, often contain exquisite decoration. The tomb of Nefertari, for instance, features vibrant scenes of the queen interacting with deities, affirming her role in the afterlife alongside the king. The concept of immortality was not confined to royalty by the New Kingdom. Elite officials commissioned tombs with painted scenes of daily life, agriculture, banquets, and offerings. These images were believed to function magically, ensuring sustenance beyond death. The democratization of afterlife belief expanded participation in the eternal order. Temple festivals provided moments of direct interaction between populace and deity. During processions, cult statues were carried outside sanctuaries. Music, incense, and celebration accompanied these events. The pharaoh's presence linked community to divine forces. Ritual performance reinforced collective identity. Architectural innovation continued throughout the New Kingdom. Hypostyle halls grew larger, columns more numerous. Obelisks punctuated temple courtyards. Relief carving achieved remarkable refinement. Each generation built upon previous foundations, creating layered complexes reflecting centuries of devotion. Even in periods of political strain, temple construction often persisted. Building projects legitimized rulers and employed labor. They signaled continuity even when external pressures mounted. The machinery of immortality was both spiritual and political. The transition from visible pyramids to concealed tombs did not diminish the importance of monumental expression. Instead, it redistributed it. Mortuary temples remained visible along the Nile, while burial chambers retreated into secrecy. The balance between public display and private preservation shifted. As the New Kingdom progressed toward its later phases, maintaining this complex system became increasingly difficult. Economic challenges, foreign incursions, and internal divisions strained resources, yet the structures themselves endured. Even when temples fell into disrepair, their stone walls preserved inscriptions and images. The pharaoh's immortality depended on this network. Without priests to present offerings, without inscriptions to preserve name and title, divine continuity risked fading. The machinery required coordination across generations. Successive rulers inherited not only throne and territory, but responsibility to maintain prior cults. As central authority weakened in the late New Kingdom, the high priests of Amun in Thebes gained de facto control over Upper Egypt. The intertwining of religious and political power created new dynamics. The machinery of immortality continued to operate, but under shifting leadership. The story that follows examines how foreign influence and internal fragmentation altered the landscape. Temples still stood. Tombs still descended into cliffs. Yet the identity of the pharaoh would face new challenges as external powers entered the Nile Valley, and local dynasties competed for authority. For most people who lived along the Nile, the pharaoh was not a figure encountered face to face. He was not someone they saw riding in a chariot or standing before temple pylons. He was present in a different way. His name was spoken in tax records. His image appeared in reliefs. His regnal year marked time itself. He was distant in body, yet constant in influence. Daily life unfolded under the authority of a living God, whether or not that God was visible. The rhythm of ordinary existence followed the river. 3 seasons structured the year: inundation, when fields were submerged; emergence, when planting began; and harvest, when crops were gathered. Farmers watched the water levels carefully. When the flood receded at the right time, seeds were pressed into moist silt. Oxen pulled wooden ploughs. Grain was stored in mud brick silos. Surplus was measured and recorded by scribes acting in the king's name. Taxes were typically collected in kind. Grain, livestock, linen and other goods were assessed and transferred to state or temple storage. Officials travelled between settlements to oversee these processes. Records were written on papyrus or inscribed on ostraca. The bureaucracy that managed redistribution was an extension of royal authority. Even if villagers never saw the pharaoh, they felt the presence of his administration. Homes in rural villages were modest. Mud brick walls enclosed small rooms with flat roofs. Storage jars lined corners. Grinding stones for grain processing occupied floor space. Life centred around family and community. Women managed household tasks, weaving linen, preparing food and caring for children. Men worked fields or engaged in specialised crafts depending on location. Craft specialisation flourished in larger settlements and state-sponsored projects. Potters shaped vessels on simple wheels. Metalworkers forged tools and weapons from copper and later bronze. Carpenters crafted furniture from imported cedar. Stone carvers shaped blocks for temples and statues. Artisans who worked on royal tombs formed tightly organised communities such as Deir el-Medina. At Deir el-Medina, workers responsible for carving and painting royal tombs lived in a planned village on the west bank of Thebes. Houses were arranged along narrow streets. Administrative records reveal details about attendance, wages, and disputes. Strikes occurred when rations were delayed, demonstrating that even within a system anchored by divine kingship, labour concerns were real and negotiated. Religion permeated daily activity. Small household shrines honoured deities such as Bes and Taweret, protectors of home and childbirth. Amulets were worn for protection. Festivals provided communal celebration. During major temple processions, statues of gods were carried outside sanctuaries, allowing glimpses of sacred presence. The pharaoh's role in these events reinforced the connection between divine and ordinary. Education was limited but structured. Boys from elite families trained as scribes. Instructional texts emphasized discipline, loyalty, and respect for authority. Literacy opened paths to administrative positions. Scribes occupied a privileged status because they translated spoken orders into written record, preserving the king's directives. Marriage contracts and legal disputes were documented formally. Women could own property and engage in transactions. Legal cases were heard by local councils, but ultimate authority rested with the crown. Justice was framed as restoration of Ma'at. When judgments were issued, they were issued in alignment with the divine order the pharaoh embodied. Food varied by status. Bread and beer formed staples for most households. Vegetables such as onions, garlic and lentils supplemented diet. Fish from the Nile provided protein. Wealthier families consumed more meat, including beef and fowl. Banquet scenes depicted in tomb paintings emphasize abundance and celebration, though such feasts were not everyday occurrences. Clothing was typically simple linen garments. Men wore kilts, women wore sheath dresses. Jewellery indicated status and taste. Cosmetics, including kohl for eyes, served both aesthetic and protective purposes. Even modest households valued personal adornment. Transportation relied on the Nile. Boats moved goods and people efficiently. Travel by land occurred via donkeys or on foot. Trade routes connected Egypt with Nubia, the Levant and beyond. Imported goods such as incense, cedar wood and precious stones entered local markets, filtering through elite channels. Military service offered another avenue of advancement. Soldiers received land grants and shares of spoils from campaigns. The pharaoh as warrior influenced perceptions of honour and duty. Participation in military expeditions linked individuals directly to the king's protective role. Death and burial were integrated into daily expectation. Cemeteries lay beyond village boundaries, often on the West Bank. Families prepared tombs with care according to means. Coffins, shabti figures intended to perform labour in the afterlife, and funerary texts accompanied the deceased. The belief in continued existence shaped how life was lived. The presence of the pharaoh influenced architecture even at local levels. Small temples in provincial towns included reliefs of the king making offerings. His image sanctioned rituals. The repetition of this imagery reinforced awareness that divine authority underpinned all sacred activity. Work in temple estates provided employment. Large complexes such as Karnak operated like economic centres. Priests, scribes, gardeners, bakers, and craftsmen supported daily offerings. Temple granaries stored surplus. Festivals organised by temple administration structured communal calendars. Environmental challenges affected everyone. Low Nile floods could threaten harvests. In such times, local officials managed distribution carefully. Inscriptions sometimes praised governors who fed their people during scarcity. Even then, the overarching narrative tied prosperity or hardship to cosmic balance maintained by the king. Foreign residents, including Nubians and Asiatics, lived within Egyptian society, particularly in urban centres and frontier regions. Some integrated through military or trade roles. Cultural exchange occurred gradually. The pharaoh's image as universal ruler encompassed these interactions. Artistic expression appeared not only in monumental reliefs, but in everyday objects. Pottery designs, carved amulets, and painted furniture reflected aesthetic values shared across classes. Music accompanied festivals and domestic life. Harps, flutes, and percussion instruments appear in tomb scenes. The state's demand for labour during large building projects temporarily relocated workers. Agricultural communities contributed manpower during inundation. Participation reinforced collective identity. The king's projects were not distant abstractions. They were part of communal experience. Women held visible roles in both domestic and religious spheres. Some served as chantresses or priestesses within temple contexts. Royal women, particularly queens and princesses, participated in rituals and appear prominently in reliefs. Their presence reinforced dynastic continuity. Children learned trades from parents or entered scribal schools if circumstances allowed. Toys recovered from archaeological sites suggest attention to play and socialization. Education was practical, oriented towards sustaining social roles. The calendar structured daily life through festivals and regional counting. Years were named after significant events in earlier periods and later counted sequentially by reign. The pharaoh's rule thus marked time itself. Living under a king meant measuring life according to his years. As the new kingdom progressed and later dynasties faced increasing pressure, daily life continued with resilience. Political shifts at the top did not immediately transform village routines. Farmers still planted, artisans still carved, priests still recited prayers. Yet the stability that characterized much of Egypt's history would eventually be tested more severely by foreign domination and internal division. The identity of the pharaoh as living god would confront new realities when external powers assumed the throne. The next phase of this account considers how foreign rulers adopted Egyptian kingship and how the institution adapted once more. The centuries that followed the height of the New Kingdom did not end with a single dramatic collapse. Instead, authority thinned gradually. Temples still stood, tombs were still carved, priests still recited rituals at dawn, yet the balance between throne, treasury, and temple shifted in ways that made centralized control harder to sustain. The image of the pharaoh as universal ruler remained carved in stone, but the political reality beneath it fractured. After the long reign of Rameses II and the defensive campaigns of Rameses III, Egypt faced mounting pressures. The invasions of the so-called Sea Peoples during the 20th dynasty strained military resources. Reliefs at Medinet Habu depict dramatic naval battles and land engagements, presenting Rameses III as victorious defender. Even if these campaigns succeeded in halting incursions, the cost was significant. Administrative records from Deir el-Medina reveal something unprecedented. Documented worker strikes. Tomb builders halted work because rations were delayed. Grain shortages affected state employees. Such events suggest that the economic system supporting royal projects had weakened. The machinery that once sustained empire and monumental construction began to falter. At the same time, the priesthood of Amun at Thebes accumulated immense wealth and authority. Endowments granted over generations had expanded temple estates. High priests controlled agricultural land, labour forces and regional administration in Upper Egypt. While they continued to acknowledge the pharaoh's authority, their power was substantial enough to rival the throne. By the end of the 20th dynasty, effective control of Egypt had divided. In the north, Tanis became a political centre. In the south, Thebes operated under strong priestly leadership. This separation marked the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period. Kings continued to reign, but their reach was uneven. The 21st dynasty rulers at Tanis adopted full pharaonic titulary and ritual roles. They did not present themselves as foreign or illegitimate, yet their control over Upper Egypt was limited. High priests of Amun effectively governed Thebes, sometimes placing their own family members in key positions. Authority was negotiated rather than absolute. Nubia, long influenced by Egyptian culture, emerged as a significant power. The kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata, adopted many elements of Egyptian religion and kingship. Kushite rulers revered Amun and built temples in Egyptian style. In the 8th century BCE, they advanced northward and eventually took control of Egypt, establishing the 25th dynasty. The Kushite pharaohs, including Piye and Taharqa, did not dismantle Egyptian traditions. They embraced them. They restored temples, emphasized devotion to Amun, and presented themselves as rightful successors to earlier kings. Their rule reflects the adaptability of Egyptian kingship. Foreign origin did not prevent adoption of divine blueprint. However, external pressures continued. The Assyrian Empire expanded across the Near East. Assyrian campaigns reached Egypt during the 7th century BCE. Thebes was sacked in 663 BCE under Ashurbanipal. This event marked a turning point. Though local dynasties later regained some control, Egypt's vulnerability to powerful neighbours was evident. The 26th dynasty, known as the Sate period, restored relative stability. Kings such as Psamtik I reasserted centralised control and promoted cultural revival. Artistic styles consciously imitated earlier periods, particularly the Old Kingdom. This archaism signalled continuity and legitimacy amid changing geopolitical realities. Foreign mercenaries, particularly Greeks and Carians, were employed within Egyptian armies during this period. Trade with Mediterranean powers expanded. Greek settlements appeared in the delta. Cultural exchange intensified, setting the stage for later Hellenistic influence. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II conquered Egypt, establishing it as a satrapy within the Achaemenid Empire. Persian rulers adopted pharaonic titulary and participated in traditional rituals. They built temples and supported priesthoods to legitimize their authority. Yet ultimate power rested outside Egypt's borders. Persian control fluctuated over the next century. Native revolts occasionally restored short-lived dynasties. Each resurgence reaffirmed traditional kingship, even when geopolitical realities limited independence. The pattern was consistent. External rulers could claim the throne, but they had to conform to Egyptian ideology to maintain acceptance. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed as liberator from Persian rule. He founded the city of Alexandria, which would become a major cultural centre. After his death, his general Ptolemy established a dynasty that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions. The Ptolemies adopted pharaonic regalia and participated in temple rituals. They were depicted in traditional relief style offering to Egyptian gods. At the same time, they governed through a Hellenistic administrative framework and promoted Greek culture in urban centres. Dual identity characterised their rule. The division between Greek-speaking elites and native Egyptian population created social complexity. Yet the temples continued to function. Priests preserved hieroglyphic writing and ritual knowledge. The pharaoh, even when Macedonian by origin, was still represented as divine intermediary. Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, navigated alliances with Roman leaders Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Her reign reflects both adaptation and vulnerability. She presented herself in Egyptian style within temples while engaging in Mediterranean politics. After her defeat by Octavian in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of Rome. Roman emperors adopted pharaonic imagery in Egyptian contexts, though they did not reside in Egypt as traditional kings had. The institution of divine kingship persisted symbolically within temple reliefs for centuries, even as political authority shifted permanently beyond the Nile Valley. Throughout these centuries of division and foreign rule, one pattern remains clear. External powers did not erase Egyptian kingship. They appropriated it. The divine blueprint proved resilient. Whether Nubian, Persian, Macedonian or Roman, rulers understood that legitimacy in Egypt required participation in established ritual and iconography. However, political fragmentation reduced centralized autonomy. Economic resources were increasingly tied to broader imperial systems. The temple estates that once functioned under exclusively Egyptian oversight now operated within foreign administrative frameworks. The decline was not solely military. It was structural. The concentration of temple wealth, the reliance on mercenaries, the shifting trade routes, and the growing power of external empires all contributed to gradual transformation. Egypt remained culturally distinct, but its geopolitical dominance faded. Yet the continuity of religious practice and monumental construction into the Ptolemaic period demonstrates remarkable persistence. Temples at Edfu, Dendera and Philae were built or expanded under Greek rulers in traditional style. Hieroglyphic inscriptions continued. The language of kingship endured. As foreign crowns multiplied, the title of pharaoh remained adaptable. It was less about ethnicity and more about ritual performance. The institution that began with unification under Neama had survived drought, division and conquest. It evolved through incorporation rather than elimination. The final phase of this long arc centres on Cleopatra, whose reign symbolised both culmination and transition. Her life would represent the last chapter of native pharaonic tradition, before integration into the Roman world transformed Egypt's political landscape permanently. By the time Cleopatra VII was born, Egypt had been ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty for nearly 3 centuries. These rulers were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. They governed from Alexandria, a city built on Mediterranean trade and Greek culture, while simultaneously presenting themselves in temples along the Nile as traditional pharaohs. Cleopatra inherited not only a throne, but a divided identity. Unlike many of her predecessors in the Ptolemaic line, Cleopatra learned the Egyptian language. She participated actively in temple rituals and was depicted in reliefs wearing the regalia of a pharaoh: the Nemes headdress, the uraeus cobra, the tripartite kilt. In inscriptions at Dendera and other temple sites, she appears offering to gods in conventional style. Within Egyptian religious space, she was not a foreign queen. She was the living embodiment of kingship. Yet her political reality was inseparable from Rome. The Mediterranean world had shifted. The Roman Republic had expanded eastward, absorbing territories that once balanced one another. Egypt's wealth in grain made it strategically vital. Roman leaders understood that control of the Nile Valley meant influence over food supply for their capital. Cleopatra ascended the throne in 51 BCE at 18 years old, initially co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, as Ptolemaic custom required sibling marriage and joint authority. Internal court politics were unstable. Advisors manoeuvred for influence. Soon, conflict erupted between Cleopatra and her brother's faction, forcing her temporary exile. Her return was facilitated by Julius Caesar. When Caesar pursued his rival Pompey into Egypt, he found himself drawn into the dynastic dispute. Cleopatra famously secured an audience with him, a meeting later dramatized by Roman writers. Their alliance restored her position. After Caesar's victory in Alexandria, she regained the throne, now co-ruling with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. The relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar produced a son, Ptolemy XV Caesarion. Cleopatra presented him as heir, reinforcing both Egyptian and Roman legitimacy. She travelled to Rome and resided there for a time, an unusual move for a pharaoh. Statues of her were erected in the city. Her presence signalled Egypt's entanglement with Roman politics. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra returned to Egypt. The Roman world fractured into competing factions. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's former allies, emerged as a powerful figure in the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra allied with him, both politically and personally. Their relationship reshaped the balance of power. In Alexandria, their union was celebrated with ceremony. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children. Coins minted during this period depict their profiles side by side, presenting partnership rather than subordination. Yet Roman narratives portrayed Cleopatra as manipulative and foreign, shaping perceptions that would endure. Within Egypt, Cleopatra continued to act as pharaoh. Temple inscriptions show her performing rituals and presenting offerings. She aligned herself with the goddess Isis, emphasizing divine motherhood and protection. This identification strengthened her position among Egyptian subjects. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, where territories were symbolically distributed among Cleopatra and Antony's children, intensified Roman opposition. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, framed Antony as compromised by foreign influence. Cleopatra became central to this narrative. The final conflict culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were defeated by Octavian. Retreating to Egypt, they faced inevitable Roman conquest. Antony took his own life. Cleopatra, after negotiations failed, followed. According to tradition, she chose death rather than capture, often associated with the image of an asp bite, though details remain uncertain. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt was annexed as a Roman province. Octavian, now Augustus, absorbed its wealth into the Roman system. The line of Ptolemaic pharaohs ended. Caesarion was executed. The institution of independent kingship in Egypt ceased. Yet Cleopatra's reign does not represent simple decline. It illustrates adaptation under extreme geopolitical pressure. She navigated alliances with the most powerful men of her time, using diplomacy, cultural fluency, and calculated symbolism. Her rule bridged 2 worlds, the ancient tradition of divine kingship and the emerging dominance of Rome. Temple construction continued during her reign. The Mamisi at Dendera, dedicated to the birth of Horus, includes reliefs of Cleopatra and Caesarion performing ritual acts. These carvings affirm her legitimacy within Egyptian theology. Even as Rome's shadow lengthened, the machinery of immortality remained active. Cleopatra's image in later Roman literature often emphasized seduction and excess. These portrayals served political ends, justifying conquest. Egyptian evidence presents a different perspective. A ruler engaged in ritual duty, economic management, and diplomatic strategy. The duality of her identity reflects the complexity of Ptolemaic rule. In Alexandria, Greek language and culture dominated court life. In temple contexts, hieroglyphs and traditional iconography prevailed. Cleopatra moved between these spheres with unusual fluency. The Roman annexation did not erase Egyptian religion immediately. Temples continued to function for centuries under Roman administration. Emperors were depicted in pharaonic form within Egyptian sanctuaries. The visual language endured even as political sovereignty ended. Cleopatra's legacy endures partly because she stands at the threshold between ancient and classical worlds. Her reign marks the final chapter of independent pharaonic authority, yet the institution she embodied did not vanish entirely. Its symbols and rituals persisted within Roman frameworks. The long arc that began with Narmer's unification concluded politically with Cleopatra's death. But the idea of the pharaoh, divine mediator, guardian of Maat, living link between earth and cosmos, outlasted the throne itself. As the narrative turns toward reflection on that endurance, the continuity of belief becomes as significant as the chronology of rule. When Cleopatra died and Egypt became a province of Rome, the political institution of pharaonic kingship ended in practical terms. There would be no more coronations in the traditional sense, no more native rulers wearing the double crown as independent sovereigns. Yet the idea of the pharaoh did not dissolve with annexation. It shifted, persisted, and resurfaced in forms that extended far beyond the last dynasty. Roman emperors understood quickly that Egypt could not be governed effectively through force alone. The Nile Valley possessed a deeply rooted religious and cultural structure. To maintain stability, Rome adopted elements of that structure. In temples at Philae, Dendera, and Edfu, reliefs depict Roman emperors dressed as pharaohs, presenting offerings to Egyptian gods. These scenes were not symbolic gestures for tourists. They were part of ongoing ritual practice. The emperor in Rome did not reside in Thebes or Memphis. He did not oversee inundation measurements or led Opet festivals personally. Yet within the temple walls, his image performed those functions. The machinery of ritual continued, projecting continuity despite the shift in political power. For the priesthood and local communities, the visual presence of a pharaoh-like figure maintained the structure of sacred order. Hieroglyphic inscriptions persisted well into the Roman period. Priests continued to write in traditional script on temple walls. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to the 4th century CE at Philae. By that time, the Roman Empire had undergone profound transformation, including the spread of Christianity. Even so, Egyptian ritual language endured for centuries after Cleopatra. The concept of divine kingship proved adaptable because it was embedded in landscape and architecture. Temples functioned as centres of economy and identity. Festivals structured communal calendars. Even when political authority lay elsewhere, the symbolic framework remained meaningful. Over time, however, Christianity gained influence across Egypt. By the late Roman period, traditional temple worship declined. Imperial decrees closed some sanctuaries. Priestly institutions lost patronage. The sacred spaces that had sustained pharaonic ideology gradually fell silent. Yet silence did not equal erasure. The monuments remained. Colossal statues stood in desert sands. Obelisks were transported to Rome and later to other European cities, recontextualized but not destroyed. The memory of ancient kingship migrated into new cultural narratives. Greek and Roman writers had already incorporated Egyptian imagery into their accounts. Herodotus described monuments and rulers, sometimes inaccurately, but preserving awareness of antiquity. Later, historians and travellers repeated and reshaped these stories. Pharaoh became a symbol of ancient authority, sometimes wise, sometimes tyrannical, always powerful. In religious texts outside Egypt, the term pharaoh entered broader tradition. Biblical narratives refer to unnamed pharaohs in stories of Joseph and Moses. These accounts, composed in different cultural contexts, reinforced the image of a ruler who embodied immense power. The historical details blurred, but the archetype persisted. During the Islamic period, Egypt's ancient monuments attracted attention and speculation. Medieval scholars wrote about pyramids and temples, sometimes attributing them to legendary figures. The physical presence of ancient architecture ensured that memory could not vanish entirely. European exploration and colonial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries reignited fascination with ancient Egypt. Napoleon's expedition in 1798 brought scholars who documented monuments systematically. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone enabled the decipherment of hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in 1822. For the first time in centuries, the voices carved into temple walls could be read again. Archaeology transformed Pharaoh from legend into documented history. Excavations at Saqqara, Thebes, and Giza uncovered tombs, papyri, and statues. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 captivated global audiences. Pharaoh became a central figure in modern imagination, represented in museums, literature, and film. The persistence of pharaonic imagery in modern Egyptian identity reflects layered continuity. National symbols sometimes draw on ancient motifs. Obelisks and statues remain landmarks. The Nile still defines geography. Though political systems changed repeatedly, the ancient past forms part of cultural heritage. In academic study, the institution of kingship continues to be examined for insights into governance, religion, and state formation. Scholars analyze administrative papyri, temple inscriptions, and burial goods to reconstruct structures of power. The divine blueprint that shaped millennia of rule informs comparative studies of ancient civilizations. Pharaoh's endurance lies partly in the material durability of stone. Pyramids remain visible from kilometers away. Temples, even in ruin, convey scale and ambition. These structures anchor memory physically. They resist complete disappearance. It also lies in narrative adaptability. Different eras reinterpret Pharaoh according to contemporary concerns. In some retellings, he symbolizes oppression. In others, wisdom and achievement. The figure becomes a mirror for broader questions about authority and legacy. The idea of kingship as mediator between divine and earthly realms did not vanish entirely even within Christian and Islamic contexts. Concepts of sacred rulership, divine sanction, and moral responsibility continued to shape political thought. Though not direct continuations, they echo structural themes present in ancient Egypt. Modern Egypt no longer crowns pharaohs. Its governance operates within entirely different frameworks. Yet the ancient past remains visible in language, tourism, scholarship, and art. Museums display mummies and statues as artifacts, but they also represent continuity of human ambition and belief. The fall of the throne did not eliminate the concept. It shifted it from living institution to historical legacy. The machinery of immortality built through temples and tombs achieved a form of success. The names of kings still circulate thousands of years later. Their monuments continue to inspire study and debate. The story that began with a river shaping communities and culminated in empire and foreign crowns does not conclude with disappearance. Instead, it transitions into memory. The pharaoh persists not as reigning sovereign, but as enduring symbol embedded in stone, text, and imagination. As the long arc of rule settles into reflection, the presence of those ancient kings lingers along the Nile. Their crowns are no longer worn, yet their imprint remains woven into the landscape and into the record of human history. For more than 3,000 years, the people of the Nile lived within a system that placed a single human being at the center of the universe. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader. He was the axis around which order revolved. His health was tied to harvest. His rituals were tied to sunrise. His victories were tied to the defeat of chaos itself. When he entered a temple, he did so as intermediary between visible and invisible worlds. When he died, entire architectural landscapes were mobilized to secure his continued existence. From the first unification of Upper and Lower Egypt to the final days of Cleopatra, power in Egypt carried sacred weight. It was not framed as personal ambition alone. it was framed as maintenance. The king upheld Ma'at. Without him, disorder threatened. This belief shaped architecture, law, art, and daily labour. It justified enormous concentration of resources in a single institution. Yet that concentration did not guarantee permanence. Drought could weaken authority. Rival elites could divide territory. Foreign armies could cross borders. Even the most absolute power operated within environmental and geopolitical constraints. The divine blueprint was strong, but it was not invulnerable. When the political office of Pharaoh ended, the idea of sacred rulership did not disappear entirely. It migrated. In some eras and cultures, rulers claimed divine favour or mandate. In others, authority was justified through law, constitution, or popular consent. The language changed. The structure of power continued to evolve. Ancient Egypt offers a long case study in how power can be stabilized through shared belief. The population participated in rituals that affirmed the king's role. Priests enacted ceremonies that sustained divine presence. Administrators recorded harvests and taxes in his name. Power was not only imposed from above, it was enacted collectively. At the same time, the story reveals limits. When central administration weakened, local authorities filled gaps. When floods failed, the narrative of divine control faltered. When foreign rulers arrived, they adopted existing symbols rather than erasing them, recognizing that legitimacy required cultural continuity. Modern systems of governance differ profoundly. Authority may derive from elections, inherited monarchy, military control, or institutional frameworks. The language of divinity is less common in many states, yet the core question persists. How does power sustain order without becoming disorder itself? The pharaoh embodied a model where political and cosmic stability were inseparable. Today, the separation between religion and state is common in many societies. Laws are debated publicly. Leaders are questioned openly. Institutions outlast individuals through codified procedures rather than ritual transformation. Even so, symbols still matter. Flags, constitutions, ceremonies of office, and public monuments all communicate continuity and legitimacy. Ancient Egypt used colossal statues and temple reliefs. Modern states use architecture, media, and civic ritual. The mediums differ. The purpose overlaps. The endurance of pharaonic imagery suggests that concentrated authority leaves a strong imprint. The pyramids remain visible thousands of years after their builders vanished. The names of Ramesses and Hatshepsut continue to circulate. Memory extends influence beyond lifespan. There is also a caution embedded in the record. When power becomes too centralized without adaptive capacity, strain accumulates. The Old Kingdom's drought exposed administrative limits. The Amarna experiment revealed vulnerability when religious structures were altered too abruptly. The New Kingdom's expansion stretched resources across vast territories. Balance was essential. If ancient kings ruled like gods, it was because society agreed to see them that way. Divine status was reinforced through repeated ritual and representation. Once belief shifted or conditions changed, the aura required reinforcement or adaptation. No throne stood outside the realities of climate, economy, and human ambition. The Nile still flows as it did in pre-dynastic times. Its annual cycle continues, moderated now by modern dams rather than temple prayers. The land that once supported divine kingship supports a modern nation-state. The continuity of geography contrasts with the evolution of governance. Looking back across millennia, the pharaoh appears at once distant and familiar. The regalia and rituals belong to another era, yet the human desire to anchor society in stable authority persists. The mechanisms have changed, but the underlying need for order remains recognizable. Power in ancient Egypt was visible in stone and ceremony. Power now often operates through systems and networks less monumental, but equally consequential. Where ancient rulers carved victories into temple walls, modern leaders broadcast policies through digital media. Each era defines legitimacy in its own terms. The story of the Pharaohs does not offer a simple lesson. It offers perspective. It shows how deeply power can intertwine with belief. It demonstrates resilience and fragility in equal measure. It reveals that authority, even when framed as divine, depends on material and social foundations. As the sequence of rulers fades into history, what remains are structures, texts, and the enduring human effort to define order. The crowns are no longer worn. The temples no longer receive daily offerings in the same way. Yet the imprint of that system continues to inform scholarship, culture, and imagination. The question of what power means now does not require comparison to divine kingship, but reflection benefits from it. Ancient Egypt sustained one of the longest continuous political traditions in human history. It did so by embedding authority within shared cosmology and practical administration. Time moved forward. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign crowns were placed upon Egyptian heads. The last pharaoh died, and the title became memory. Still, the stones remain, and the record endures, offering a long horizon against which modern authority can be measured, examined, and understood within a broader human story that began beside a river and continues wherever societies seek balance between leadership and order.